Ethan Walker stood in the rain with his revolver drawn, aimed at nothing but the dark, his hand shaking harder than the storm around him. Behind him, the fire that had been his only shelter for 3 nights had gone cold and dead. Ahead of him, the town of Silver Creek lay silent, a place that had already decided who he was before he ever said a word. He had ridden 400 miles just to disappear. But when a door creaked open behind him, and a woman's voice cut through the thunder asking if he had eaten, Ethan Walker understood, for the first time in years, that running had never once saved him. Before we go on, I invite you to subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Please leave a comment and tell me which city you're watching from tonight so I can see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it started, Silver Creek, Montana, in the summer of 1885. The storm had been chasing him since Cheyenne. Ethan Walker felt it before he saw it. That pressure behind his eyes, that itch under his collar, that told a man weather was coming whether he liked it or not. He'd learned a long time ago not to argue with the sky. Arguing with the sky was a young man's mistake, and Ethan wasn't young anymore, not in the ways that counted. His horse, a gray gelding named Samson, didn't care for the wind either. The animal's ears kept swiveling back toward the black clouds rolling over the ridge, and Ethan could feel the tension traveling up through the reins into his own hands. "Easy," he said low. "Just a little farther." Samson didn't believe him. Smart horse. The first fat drops hit Ethan's hat brim around dusk, and by full dark, the sky had opened up like something furious, like something that had been holding its breath for 100 miles, and finally let it go right over his head. Lightning cracked white across the hills, and in that flash, Ethan saw the shape of a town, a scatter of buildings hunched along a muddy street, a few windows glowing gold through the downpour. Silver Creek. He didn't know the name yet, didn't much care. A roof was a roof. He put his heels to Samson, and the horse lurched forward, hooves sucking at the mud, and that was when Ethan heard it, a sharp crack, leather tearing, and the sudden sickening lurch of the saddle sliding sideways under him. Whoa, whoa now. He came off hard boots, hitting mud, one hand still fisted in the reins, and for a second, man and horse just stood there in the rain, breathing at each other. Ethan looked down. The girth strap had split clean through old leather, finally giving up after who knew how many years of neglect, his neglect, if he was honest, because a man who didn't stay anywhere long enough to matter didn't much bother fixing what could wait. "Well," he said to the horse, "reckon that settles it. We're walking." Samson snorted like he'd known that all along. Ethan gathered the broken strap in one fist, slung his saddlebags over his shoulder, and started walking into town, on foot, leading his horse through the mud and the dark and the rain that had no intention of letting up. The street was empty. Smart people were inside. Ethan had never been accused of being smart, not about weather, and not about much else that involved staying dry, staying safe, staying put. He passed a saloon with light spilling yellow out its windows and the sound of a badly tuned piano fighting to be heard over the storm. He passed a shuttered mercantile, a church with its doors closed against the wind, a livery stable that looked promising but showed no light and no life. Then he saw it. A small shop, narrow-fronted, squeezed between 2 darker buildings, and in its window burning steady, despite the wind rattling the glass, a single lantern. Ethan stopped in the street and looked at that light for longer than made sense. There was something about a lit window in a storm. Something that reached into a man and pulled at whatever was still soft in him. Ethan hadn't let much stay soft in him for a long time, but that lantern got past his guard before he even knew it was trying. He told himself it was just about the saddle. A shop meant tools. Tools meant he could maybe patch the strap enough to get moving again come morning. That was the story he told himself anyway. He tied Samson under the thin shelter of the awning, climbed 2 wooden steps slick with rain, and raised his fist to knock. Then he hesitated. A man who knocked on a stranger's door this late, soaked through unshaven, carrying a colt on his hip, and trouble in his eyes, Whether he meant to or not, that man could expect a shotgun answering the door as easy as a hello. Ethan almost turned around. Almost went back to the saloon, took his chances sleeping in the livery hay for free, avoided all this. But the rain was coming down like the whole sky had turned to river, and Samson needed a dry strap, or he needed a new horse, and Ethan Walker was tired, not just wet and cold tired, but the other kind, the kind that lived in the bones and didn't wash out. He knocked 3 times. Firm. The knock of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to lose by looking like he did. For a moment, nothing. Then footsteps. Light, quick, unafraid, which surprised him. A woman alone should have moved slower, more careful toward a door at this hour. The door opened on a chain, first a sliver of gold lamplight and one careful eye. "Who's there?" "Name's Ethan Walker, ma'am." "Sorry for the hour. My horse's girth strap broke about a quarter-mile back, and I saw your light. Was hoping you might have a needle and some heavy thread I could borrow or buy off you if you'll sell it. I'll be gone soon as it's fixed." Silence. The eye studied him. Rain ran down the back of Ethan's neck, and he stood there and let himself be looked at, because a man who flinched from being looked at gave people every reason to be afraid of him. "You alone." "Just me and my horse, ma'am." "You a drinking man?" "Not tonight." Something in that answer must have satisfied her, or maybe it was just that no woman in her right mind kept a stranger standing in a storm forever deciding. The chain slid free. The door opened wider. Clara Bennett stood in the doorway of her own shop like she owned every inch of the ground under her feet, which Ethan supposed she did. She wasn't a tall woman, but she held herself like one spine straight, chin level, and there was a steadiness in her eyes that Ethan recognized, because he'd seen it before in men who'd survived things that should have broken them. "Well, don't just stand there dripping on my step," she said. "Come in before you catch your death, Mr. Walker." He hadn't expected that. He'd expected suspicion, maybe a door shut in his face, maybe the needle and thread handed out through a 2-inch gap and nothing more. He had not expected to be invited in. "Ma'am, I don't want to trouble you." "You're already troubling me standing there letting all my warm air out. Come in." Ethan stepped inside, pulling his hat off out of habit water running off the brim onto her floor. He winced at that. "Sorry about your floor." "Floor's seen worse than rainwater, Mr. Walker." She shut the door behind him, threw the bolt, and turned to look at him properly, for the first time in full light. Whatever she saw, she didn't say. But Ethan felt the weight of that look all the same, felt like she was reading something off him, the way a rancher reads weather off a sky quick and practiced, and not entirely wrong. "You said a strap broke." "Girth strap. Old leather, my fault for not replacing it sooner." "Bring it in. I'll take a look." He hesitated. "I was only meaning to borrow a needle, ma'am. Didn't come here to put more work on you tonight." Clara arched a brow at him, and there was something dry and almost amused underneath the exhaustion he could see sitting behind her eyes. "Mr. Walker, I sew for a living. A busted strap on a rainy night is the most interesting thing that's happened to me in a week. Bring it in." He went back out into the rain, unhooked the ruined strap from the saddle, gave Samson's neck a pat and a low word of apology for making him stand wet a while longer, and carried the broken leather back inside. The shop was small and close, and smelled of wax thread and cedar, and something warm underneath that, something like bread, like a kitchen not far off. There were bolts of cloth stacked along one wall, a workbench scattered with pins and shears, and behind a curtain at the back, Ethan could just make out the shape of a modest kitchen table. Clara took the strap from him, turned it over in her hands, ran her thumb along the split. "This has been fraying a long while," she said. "You're lucky it didn't go while you were riding hard. Would have put you on the ground at a bad angle." "Wouldn't be the first bad angle I've hit the ground at." She glanced up at that, just briefly. Filed it away maybe the way people did with things a stranger let slip without meaning to. "Sit," she said, nodding at a stool near the workbench. "This'll take me a few minutes. No sense you standing there dripping the whole while." Ethan sat. It felt strange sitting in a stranger's shop at this hour, water pooling faintly under his boots, watching a widow's hands work a needle through leather with quick, practiced motions. There was something almost hypnotic in it, something that made the tightness in his shoulders, the tightness that had lived there so long, he'd half forgotten it wasn't natural ease just slightly. "You got a name for that horse of yours?" Clara asked, not looking up. "Samson." "Strong name. Strong horse. Stubborn, too. Sounds like most things worth having." She tied off a stitch bit, the thread with her teeth moved to the next. "You passing through Mr. Walker, or you got business in Silver Creek?" "Passing through mostly. Was headed toward the Bitterroot country. Heard there's ranch work up that way." "There's ranch work most everywhere a man's willing to do it," Clara said. "Riverside Ranch, other side of town, they're always looking for hands who know horses. Old Silas Cobb runs the crew. Man's got a temper like a rattlesnake with a toothache, but he pays fair, and he don't ask questions he don't need answered." Ethan looked at her. "You're awful helpful for someone who don't know me from Adam." Clara's hands didn't stop moving. "You knocked instead of trying the latch. You apologized for my floor before you apologized for waking me. You called Silas Cobb's temper a rattlesnake with a toothache in your head. Just now I can tell. And you were too polite to say it out loud." A faint, almost invisible smile. "I've met worse men in daylight with better manners on the surface, Mr. Walker. I know how to tell the difference." He didn't have an answer for that. Didn't trust himself to try one. The rain kept hammering the roof steady and relentless, and for a while neither of them spoke, and it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the kind of quiet that happened between two people who didn't feel the need to fill every space with noise. Finally, Clara set the strap aside, finished the stitching tight and even. "There," she said. "That'll hold. Better than it did before, if I'm honest with myself." She held it out to him. Ethan took it, turned it over in his hands the way she had. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing tonight. It's late, it's storming, and you're not going anywhere till morning anyhow, unless you fancy sleeping in the mud." She studied him a moment, and something shifted in her face, some decision being made behind those steady eyes. "You eaten?" The question landed on Ethan like a physical thing, like a hand placed flat against his chest. "Ma'am, I asked if you've eaten. Simple enough question." "I know, not since this morning." "Well, that's no good." Clara was already moving toward the curtain at the back, toward that kitchen he'd glimpsed, and there was something brisk and unbothered in the way she said it, like feeding a total stranger at this hour was the most ordinary thing in the world to her. "I made too much stew for one person, like I do most nights, because I never learned to cook small. Come sit. Eat something hot before you go catch your death standing around out there, arguing with me about it." "Ma'am, I really don't want to impose—" "Mr. Walker." She turned in the curtain's gap and looked at him, and there was steel in it now, gentle steel, the kind that didn't bend, but also didn't cut. "I've been alone in this shop for 3 years. I've fed exactly no one but myself in all that time. Let an old widow enjoy a little company for once instead of arguing with me like I've asked you to rob a bank." Ethan felt something crack open in his chest, small and quiet, like ice giving the first inch on a frozen creek. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "Thank you." He followed her through the curtain into the kitchen, small warm a stove still holding heat, a table with 2 mismatched chairs, like maybe once there'd been more than 2, but not anymore. Clara ladled stew into a bowl, set it in front of him with a heel of bread, and then, instead of retreating, poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him like this was the most natural thing in the world. Ethan looked at the bowl, looked at her. "You're not eating." "Already ate mine. This is just company." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Go on, before it's cold." He ate. And it wasn't just that the stew was good, though it was rich with beef and carrots and something like thyme that reminded him of a kitchen he hadn't let himself think about in years. It was that nobody had put a hot meal in front of him and just sat there wanting nothing back in a very long time. Every meal Ethan had eaten for the better part of a decade had come with a price tag on it, whether that was coin at some roadside diner or the silent obligation of a ranch bunkhouse where a man ate what was put in front of him and kept his mouth shut and his opinions to himself. This was different. "This is good," he said because it felt wrong not to say something. "My mother's recipe. She always said a man could forgive a great many sins if you fed him right first." Clara's mouth curved not quite a smile, something older and sadder underneath it. "I found that mostly true." "What sins are you hoping to forgive tonight?" The question came out before Ethan meant it to too honest, too close to the bone, and he almost apologized for it. But Clara just looked at him steadily over the rim of her cup. "None in particular. Just seemed to me you were carrying something heavy, Mr. Walker, and a full stomach never made a heavy thing lighter. But it does make a man able to carry it a little farther before he sets it down wrong." Ethan set his spoon down. "You always this direct with strangers. I've found strangers appreciate honesty more than most folks give them credit for. It's the people who already know you that get uncomfortable with the truth." She said it lightly, but there was a shadow behind her eyes when she said it, something that told Ethan this wasn't just a saying to her. This was something she'd learned the hard way. "Fair enough," he said. "I am carrying something. Most men my age are, I reckon, if they've lived any kind of life at all." "Most men my age too," Clara said. "Doesn't mean we have to talk about it over stew." "No," Ethan agreed, something in his chest loosening further. "Reckon it doesn't." They didn't talk about it, not that night. Instead, they talked about smaller things, about Samson's stubborn streak, about the state of the roads coming down from Cheyenne, about how Silver Creek had grown some in the last few years, on account of talk of a railroad coming through, about the way the rain sounded different on a shop roof than it did out on the open range, thinner, somehow more honest. Clara asked careful questions and didn't push when Ethan's answers went short. Ethan noticed that about her, the way she'd let a silence sit, instead of filling it with a question that dug too deep. It made him want to answer more than he normally would have. Which was, he thought, probably the whole trick of it, except it didn't feel like a trick. It felt like kindness, plain and unadorned, the kind he'd forgotten people were even capable of anymore. When the bowl was empty and the coffee had gone lukewarm in its cups, Clara stood and started clearing the table, and Ethan stood too fast to help. "Sit down, Mr. Walker. You're a guest." "Ma'am, with respect, my mother would come back from the grave and box my ears if she heard I sat there and let a woman clear my dishes while I watched." He picked up his own bowl, and after a beat hers too. "Where do these go?" Clara looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind her eyes, and then pointed to a basin near the stove. "There's fine." He washed the dishes. She dried them. It was such a small thing, such an ordinary domestic thing, and yet Ethan felt it settle into him like something significant, like a stone dropped into still water ripples going out farther than the size of the stone should have allowed. When it was done, Clara walked him back through the shop to the front door, and outside, the rain had eased, some gone, from a roar to a steady, patient drumming. "There's a livery 2 streets down," she said. "Tell Hank I sent you. He'll charge you fare for Samson, and won't ask why you're coming in at this hour looking like a drowned cat." "Thank you. For the strap. For the meal. For—" He stopped, not sure how to say the rest of it without sounding like more than he meant to. "For all of it." Clara studied him in the lamplight, rain still ticking softly against the window behind her. "You're welcome, Mr. Walker," she said. "Though I'll tell you honestly, it wasn't much trouble. Feeding a hungry man his supper isn't charity. It's just what decent people do for each other when they remember to." "Not everyone remembers." "No," Clara agreed, and something old and tired moved across her face. "Not everyone does." He tipped his hat to her, a real gesture. Not a performance of manners, but the genuine article, the kind of respect a man showed when he meant it all the way down and stepped back out into the rain. "Good night, ma'am." "Good night, Mr. Walker. Safe travels wherever the morning takes you." He led Samson down the muddy street toward the livery, and it was only once he was out of sight of her window that Ethan let himself look back. The lantern was still burning, steady gold unwavering against the dark. He didn't know yet what that light would come to mean to him. Didn't know that in the weeks ahead, he'd find himself walking past that window more evenings than not, slowing his steps without meaning to, looking for that same steady glow, like a man checking that the world was still put together right. Didn't know that 4 simple words, "Have you eaten?" would end up meaning more to him than any sermon he'd ever half listened to in any church he'd ever passed through. All he knew, standing in the rain with a mended strap in his hand and warmth still sitting low and unfamiliar in his stomach, was that for the first time in longer than he could rightly remember, some small cautious part of him didn't want to keep riding come morning. He found the livery. Hank turned out to be a heavy-set man with a graying beard, and no interest whatsoever in why a stranger was arriving after midnight in a storm exactly as Clara had promised. Ethan paid for a stall and a rub-down for Samson, paid extra for a private word that the horse got proper oats and not the cheap feed, and then climbed the ladder to the hayloft, where Hank said travelers were welcome to bed down for a nickel. He lay in the hay listening to the rain finally beginning to taper off above him, listening to Samson shifting and settling in his stall below, and he found himself thinking against every instinct that had kept him moving for the better part of 10 years about a lit window and a woman who asked a simple question like it was the easiest thing in the world. "Have you eaten?" Nobody had asked him that in longer than he wanted to count. Not since he shut that thought down hard the way he'd trained himself to. Some doors a man learned not to open, not at midnight, not alone in a stranger's hayloft with rain on the roof and his guard worn thin from exhaustion and unexpected kindness both. But it followed him into sleep anyway. Not the accident. Not the guilt he carried like a saddle he'd never once managed to unbuckle. Just her voice, steady and plain, cutting through a storm. "Have you eaten?" He woke before dawn, out of old habit. The habit of a man who'd learned that staying in one place too long, sleeping too deep, trusting too easy, tended to cost a fella dearly. For a moment, lying in the unfamiliar hayloft with dust motes drifting gold through the cracks in the boards, he didn't remember where he was. Then it came back to him, the storm, the broken strap, the shop, the widow, the stew. He climbed down, found Hank already awake and forking hay into the stalls. "Sleep all right?" Hank asked, not looking up. "Better than I have in a while," Ethan admitted, and was a little surprised to find it true. "Storm passed through good and proper. Roads'll be a mess for a day or two, yet mud thick as molasses out toward the Bitterroot Road." Ethan considered that. Considered, too, that Samson could use a real rest after the miles they'd put behind them, and that a horse pushed too hard on bad roads was a horse likely to come up lame, and a lame horse 100 miles from anywhere was worse than no horse at all. "Reckon I might stick around a day or two then," he said mostly to himself. "Let the roads dry out, let my horse rest proper. Suit yourself. Riverside's always looking for hands if you're the working sort, and not just passing through drinking up your money." Hank paused. His forking looked over at Ethan with the frank assessment of a man who'd sized up 1,000 strangers over 1,000 mornings. "You got the look of a man who knows horses. Silas Cobb'll take you on quick enough if you show him you're not afraid of work." Ethan thought about the lantern in the window, still burning gold behind his eyes, though the sun was coming up gray and clean after the storm. "Where do I find this Silas Cobb?" It didn't take him long. Riverside Ranch sat on the eastern edge of town, sprawling and busy, even in the early hour hands, already moving between the barn and the corrals, the smell of coffee and wood smoke and horse thick in the cool morning air. Silas Cobb turned out to be exactly as advertised, a wiry, weathered man somewhere past 50, with eyes that missed nothing and a voice like gravel dragged over tin. "You know horses?" was the first thing out of his mouth. No greeting, no pleasantries. "Since before I could walk proper," Ethan answered. "You know fences?" "Well enough." "You drink on the job?" "No, sir." "You steal?" "No, sir." Silas Cobb looked him over. The way Hank had, the way Clara had, the night before that particular frontier squint that seemed to strip a man down to whatever truth was underneath his clothes. "You got trouble following you." Ethan hesitated just a fraction of a second, but Cobb caught it the way men who'd survived a long time caught things. "Everybody's got something following them," Ethan said finally. Questions whether it's fixing to catch up while I'm working for you. And the answer to that is no. Something that might have been approval flickered across Cobb's weathered face. Fair enough answer. $1 a day. Bunk in the east barn with the other hand's meals provided Sundays your own if you want it. Fence line needs mending out past the north pasture gate's been hanging crooked since spring. You start now or you start tomorrow. Now's fine, Ethan said. And that was that. No ceremony to it, no fuss. Just a man finding work the way men had always found work out here through plain speaking, and a willingness to put hands to labor without complaint. Ethan spent that first day mending fence under a sky scrubbed clean by the storm, and it felt good. The ordinary, honest ache of physical work, the kind that let a man's mind go quiet because his body was too busy to let old thoughts crowd in. But even with his hands full of wire and posts and the sun climbing high overhead, some part of him kept drifting back toward town, toward a narrow shopfront squeezed between two darker buildings, toward a lantern that had burned steady all through a storm, like it was daring the dark to try something. He told himself it was nothing. Told himself he'd fixed his strap, eaten a meal he was grateful for, and that debt, if it could even be called a debt, given how firmly she'd refused payment, was settled plain and simple. Told himself a man passing through had no business thinking twice about a widow's kindness, however unusual it had felt, however much it had cracked something open in his chest that he'd spent years keeping welded shut. He told himself all of that working the fence line under the Montana sun, and some part of him, some old and tired and hopeful part, he'd thought had died a long time back on a racetrack. He tried never to think about, didn't believe a word of it. That evening, walking back from the north pasture with the other hand's dust on his boots and his shirt soaked through with honest sweat, Ethan found his feet carrying him the long way around through town, past a narrow shop front with a lantern already lit gold against the coming dusk. He didn't stop, didn't knock, just slowed his steps just for a moment, just long enough to see a shape moving behind the curtain in back, the outline of a woman at a stove alone, cooking supper for one, the way she'd told him she always did. He kept walking. Told himself that was all it was. A man noting a light in a window, nothing more. But he found himself doing it again the next evening, and the one after that. Word travels quick in a town the size of Silver Creek, and it wasn't more than 3 days before Clara Bennett heard secondhand from the woman who ran the mercantile that the stranger who'd knocked on her door during the storm had taken up work at Riverside Ranch, and seemed by all accounts to be a steady hand, quiet, hard-working, no trouble to anyone. She told herself she was glad to hear it the way you'd be glad to hear any decent stranger had landed on his feet. She told herself that was all it was. But that evening, cooking stew for one, the way she'd cooked it every evening for 3 long years, she found herself without quite deciding to making just a little more than usual. Enough for 2. Though she told herself firmly she was only doing it because she'd misjudged the portions, because the pot she'd pulled down was bigger than she'd meant to grab, because old habits from a house that used to hold 4 people instead of 1 were hard to break clean. She told herself a great many things that evening, standing at her stove, with the lantern burning steady in the window behind her, the same as it had burned every night for 3 years. The same as it would burn that night too, whether or not anyone came walking past to notice it. Nobody knocked that night. Ethan Walker was 3 streets over, sitting on an overturned bucket outside the east barn at Riverside Ranch, sharing a plate of beans and cornbread with the other hands, laughing. Actually laughing low and rusty, like a sound he hadn't used in a good while. At some joke old Silas Cobb's foreman had made about a mule with more sense than half the men on the crew. But even laughing, even with tired good company around him, and honest work behind him, and a full plate in front of him, some part of Ethan Walker kept drifting back toward a narrow shop front, and a lantern he couldn't see from here, but somehow still felt burning steady and patient somewhere across town. He didn't know yet that Clara Bennett had made too much stew that night, same as she would the next and the one after that, some quiet, stubborn hope in her that she wouldn't have admitted to a living soul, not even to herself, in the honest dark of her own bedroom, where she lay awake sometimes now, listening to the wind, thinking about a tired stranger's eyes and the careful, grateful way he'd washed her dishes without being asked. He didn't know it yet, but he would, because in a town the size of Silver Creek, Two lonely people circling the same small handful of streets, drawn without quite admitting it toward the same warm light, were bound sooner or later to end up standing in front of each other again. And when that happened, neither one of them would be quite so good at telling themselves it didn't mean anything at all. It happened on a Sunday. Ethan had the day to himself, same as every hand at Riverside got, and instead of sleeping late or riding out to nowhere in particular, the way he usually did on a free day, he found himself walking into town with a coil of wire and a hammer borrowed off Silas Cobb, telling himself he was only going to check on Samson at the livery. He walked past the shop first, told himself that was just the shortest route to the livery, which wasn't strictly a lie, though it wasn't strictly the truth either. The fence behind Clara's shop was leaning bad, one whole section sagging where the posts had rotted through at the base, and Ethan stopped in the alley and looked at it the way he looked at any broken thing. Not with judgment, just with the plain assessment of a man who knew how to fix what was in front of him. He was still standing there, turning the problem over in his head, when the back door opened, and Clara stepped out with a basket of wash to hang. She stopped when she saw him. For a moment, neither of them said anything, and Ethan felt something warm and awkward move through his chest, the particular discomfort of being caught somewhere he had no real business being. "Mr. Walker." Her voice was even, but there was a small crease of surprise between her brows. "You lost—" "No, ma'am. Was walking to the livery, saw your fence was about to give out entirely." He nodded at the sagging rail. "Didn't mean to loiter, just got to studying it out of habit." Clara set her basket down on the step and came to stand beside him, looking at the same rotted posts he'd been looking at. "That fence has been dying a slow death since before my husband passed," she said. "I keep meaning to have someone see to it, keep not getting around to it. I could fix it. Wouldn't take but an hour or two, and I've got the wire right here." He held up the coil like evidence. "No charge. Consider it payment for the strap and the stew." "I told you that night I didn't want payment." "I know it. This isn't payment for you. It's payment for me, ma'am, if you'll let me put it that way. A man doesn't sleep easy owing a debt, even a debt somebody else says doesn't exist." Clara studied him for a long moment, arms crossed loosely. The Sunday morning quiet settling soft around them, broken only by a rooster somewhere down the street, and the distant murmur of church bells calling the more devout half of Silver Creek to service. "You're not a church-going man, Mr. Walker." "Used to be. Lost the habit somewhere along the way." He shrugged an economical, honest motion. "Figure fixing a widow's fence on a Sunday morning is about as close to a prayer as I've got in me these days." Something in Clara's face softened at that, though she covered it quick with a small, dry smile. "Well, I won't argue theology with a man holding a hammer. Fix the fence if it'll ease your conscience. I'll bring out coffee." He worked through the morning pulling rotted posts, setting new ones, stringing wire taut and true, and Clara came out twice with coffee, and once with a plate of biscuits, still warm from the oven, and each time she stayed a little longer than the last, standing in the yard, with her arms crossed against the morning chill, asking him questions about fence work and horses and the Bitterroot country he'd once ridden through, careful questions that never once strayed toward the things he didn't offer freely. "You're good with your hands," she said, watching him tamp the last post into place. "Spent my whole life working with them. Man's got to be good at something." "Some men spend a whole life working with their hands and still can't drive a nail straight." Clara handed him the last of the coffee. "You're not most men, Mr. Walker." He didn't quite know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything, just drank his coffee and looked at the fence, standing straight and solid where it had been sagging that morning, and felt something in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in a long, long time. The small, quiet satisfaction of having fixed something, of having left a place a little better than he found it. "Stay for supper," Clara said when the work was done and the light was starting to slant gold and low across the yard. "It's only fair. You worked half a day for a debt you invented out of thin air. Least I can do is feed you for your trouble." Ethan hesitated. Some old caution in him, the part that had learned the hard way not to let himself want anything too much, told him to say no to. Thank her kindly and walk on to keep the careful distance a drifting man ought to keep from a settled woman with a life and a shop and a town full of people watching her every move. But then he thought of the lantern in her window. Thought of the way she'd asked him that first night if he'd eaten like it was the simplest and most important question in the world. "I'd like that," he said. "Thank you, ma'am." They ate at her small kitchen table again, the same mismatched chairs. And this time, the conversation came easier, less careful, more like two people who'd already decided somewhere underneath the polite surface of things that they trusted each other at least a little. "Tell me about your husband," Ethan said, somewhere between the stew and the coffee, and immediately wondered if he'd overstepped. But Clara didn't flinch from it. She turned her cup slowly on the table, looking at it rather than him. "His name was James. He was a good man. Quiet the way you are, though he talked more once you got him going. We had a daughter, Mary Grace. She was 4. Clara's voice stayed steady, the steadiness of long practice of grief worn smooth like a stone, handled too many times. "Fever took them both inside of a week 3 winters back. I buried them on the same afternoon in the same ground, and I came home to a house with 2 empty rooms, and I lit a lantern in the window that night, because I couldn't stand the thought of the dark getting in any worse than it already had." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and meant it all the way down. "I know you are." Clara looked up at him then, and there was something fierce underneath the grief in her eyes, something that hadn't broken, no matter how hard it had been tested. "People say sorry to me a lot, Mr. Walker. Most of them mean it fine for about as long as it takes to say the word. Then they go back to treating me like I might shatter if they look at me wrong. Like grief is a sickness I might pass along if they get too close." She shook her head. "You didn't do that. That first night. You didn't look at me like I was fragile. You don't strike me as fragile, ma'am." "No," Clara said, and something like the ghost of a real smile touched her mouth. "I don't suppose I do." The evening wore on quiet and warm, and when Ethan finally rose to leave, walking back toward the ranch under a sky gone deep purple. With the last of the light, he carried something with him that felt dangerously close to hope, a feeling he'd trained himself out of a long time back, because hope in his experience was mostly just grief that hadn't happened yet. He didn't know that 3 streets over in the small stone building that served as Silver Creek's jail and law office, Sheriff Thomas Reed had already heard his name mentioned twice that week. Once from Hank at the livery, praising the quiet stranger who tipped well and treated his horse right, and once from a Riverside hand who'd mentioned in passing over a beer at the saloon that the new man Cobb had taken on seemed decent enough, kept to himself, worked harder than most. Sheriff Reed filed the name away the way a good lawman filed away. Most things not with suspicion. Exactly. Just with the habit of a man whose job was knowing who was passing through his town and whether they meant it any harm. He'd meet Ethan Walker properly 2 days later, when Ethan came into town to collect supplies for the ranch and found himself waylaid outside the mercantile by the sheriff himself, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and a badge that had seen 20 years of honest wear. "You'd be the fella staying out at Riverside," Reed said, not unfriendly, just direct the way most men in this town seemed to be. "Yes, sir. Ethan Walker. Thomas Reed. I keep the peace around here such as it needs keeping." He extended a hand, and Ethan shook it firm and even. "Heard good things about you so far, Mr. Walker. Heard you fixed up Clara Bennett's fence out back of her shop." "Yes, sir. Seemed a fair trade for a kindness she showed me." Reed studied him a moment the way lawmen tended to study everyone cataloging without seeming to. "Clara's a good woman. Been through more than her share of hard luck. Town looks out for her mostly." Something shifted slightly in his tone, not quite a warning, but close to one. "Some folks in this town look out for her a little too closely, if you take my meaning. Man named Walter Grayson's had his eye on her property for some time now. Cattle buyer, wealthy. Used to owning most things he sets his sights on. I don't follow sheriff." "You will," Reed said, not unkindly. "Give it time. Just wanted you to know the lay of the land, Mr. Walker, seeing as you seem to be sticking around a while. A man ought to know the ground he's standing on before he plants anything in it." He tipped his hat, the gesture polite but final. "Good day to you." Ethan watched him walk away, turning that conversation over in his mind. and felt a small cold thread of unease work its way into the warmth that had been building in his chest all week. He didn't understand it yet, not fully, but he understood enough that Clara Bennett's life held complications. He hadn't seen the shape of, that the town's easy welcome of him might not stay easy forever, that a man with land nobody could take, and a wealthy cattle buyer's interest crossing wires with a lonely widow's kindness toward a passing stranger was a combination that rarely stayed quiet for long. He heard the whispers himself 2 days after that, standing outside the mercantile, waiting on his order, half hidden by a stack of feed sacks, while 2 women he didn't recognize stood close together, near the window, voices pitched low, but not quite low enough. Seen him at her place 3 times this week, Doris, 3 times. Well, I heard he fixed her fence for free. What kind of man does that for a stranger unless he's got his eye on something? Could be her land he's after. Could be worse than that. Poor Clara. Hasn't had an easy day since James passed, and now this drifter shows up out of nowhere. Ethan stood very still behind the feed sacks, jaw tight, and felt something old and familiar rise up in his chest. Not anger exactly, though there was some of that too, but something closer to a bone-deep weariness. The weariness of a man who had spent years being sized up and found wanting by people who knew nothing about him beyond the shape of him standing in a doorway. He didn't say anything. Didn't step out and defend himself. Didn't give the women the satisfaction of knowing he'd heard every word. He simply collected his supplies when the mercantile clerk called his order ready, paid in full, and walked back out into the street with his jaw set and his eyes fixed straight ahead. But that night, lying in the hayloft at Riverside, listening to the other hands snore below him, Ethan found himself staring up at the dark rafters, turning an old familiar question over in his mind, the same question that had chased him across 400 miles and a decade of never staying anywhere long enough to be known. What if they're right to be careful? What if I really am the kind of trouble a good woman ought to be warned about? He thought of the accident. Thought of the sound a body made hitting hard ground at speed, a sound he still heard sometimes in the space between waking and sleeping. No matter how many miles he put behind him, no matter how many towns he left before anyone got close enough to ask the wrong question. He thought too of Clara's voice that first night, steady and certain, cutting through a storm. "Have you eaten?" 4 words. No judgment in them, no caution, no suspicion, no careful weighing of what he might be worth or what he might cost her. Just plain unguarded kindness offered to a stranger dripping rainwater on her floor, because it was the decent thing to do, and she'd decided somewhere along the way to keep doing decent things whether or not the world had earned it from her. Ethan didn't sleep easy that night. But somewhere past midnight, staring up at those dark rafters, with the whispered words of 2 gossiping women still echoing in his ears, he made a decision that surprised him with how little effort it took to make. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. Not because of the roads, not because of the horse, not because of any of the reasons he'd given himself that first morning after the storm. He was staying because, for the first time in longer than he could rightly account for, someone had looked at him tired, soaked through, carrying more weight than any one man ought to carry alone, and had not asked him what he'd done, or where he'd come from, or what he might take from her before he moved on. She had simply asked if he'd eaten. And Ethan Walker, God help him, was not yet ready to stop being a man worth asking that question of. The nights that followed the fence work fell into something Ethan hadn't let himself have in years, a rhythm. Riding in from Riverside at dusk, boots, dusty hands raw, and finding his feet carrying him down the same street, past the same window, and more often than not through the same door. Clara stopped pretending the extra portions were an accident. "You're going to make me a liar," she told him, one evening setting a second bowl down without being asked. "I've told half this town I only cook for myself." "Then don't tell them anything different," Ethan said. "Let them wonder." "They don't wonder, Mr. Walker. They talk." She said it lightly, but something behind her eyes wasn't light at all. He noticed it. Filed it away the way he filed away most things that worried him, quiet and careful, not wanting to press on a bruise before he understood how deep it ran. He found out 3 days later, standing outside the mercantile with a sack of flour on his shoulder, when a shadow fell across him that was too broad, too deliberate to belong to anyone passing through by accident. "You'd be the Riverside Hand," the man said. No greeting, no hand offered. Ethan turned. The stranger was tall, well-fed in a way that spoke of money, rather than hard living, dressed sharper than anyone had a right to be on a dusty street in Silver Creek silk vest-polished boots that had never once touched a fence line. "Depends who's asking," Ethan said. "Walter Grayson." The name came out like it was supposed to mean something like, Ethan should already be nervous. "I own most of the cattle contracts moving through this county. Man in my position likes to know who's new in town." "Ethan Walker." "I know your name, Mr. Walker. Whole town knows your name by now." Grayson's mouth curved, but it wasn't a smile. Not really. "Word is, you've been spending considerable time at Clara Bennett's shop." "Word travels fast in a small town." "Word travels exactly as fast as I let it," Grayson said, and there it was, the first real edge sharp under the silk. "I'd hate to see a decent woman's reputation suffer on account of a drifter who won't be here come winter." Ethan set the flour sack down slow, deliberate, freeing both hands without making a show of it. "Reckon that's between Mrs. Bennett and whoever she chooses to spend her time with. Not really your concern, is it?" "Everything in this town is my concern, Mr. Walker." Grayson's eyes went hard flat, the pleasant mask slipping just enough to show what sat underneath. "You do well to remember that before you get too comfortable." He walked off without waiting for a response, and Ethan stood there in the street with his jaw tight and his pulse loud in his ears, watching the man's back, and something cold settled low in his gut. Not fear exactly, but recognition. He'd met men like Grayson before. Men who mistook money for permission to own whatever they wanted, including people. He didn't tell Clara about it that night. Told himself he didn't want to worry her. She already knew. "Walter came to see you," she said, before he'd even sat down at her table, and it wasn't a question. Ethan's silence answered for him. Clara set down the coffee pot harder than she meant to. "What did he say?" "Nothing worth repeating." "Ethan?" Her voice cracked just slightly on his given name, the first time she'd used it instead of Mr. Walker, and something in his chest turned over at the sound of it. "Tell me." So he did. Told her plain word for word, as best he remembered, and watched her face go through something complicated. Anger, then something older and more tired. Underneath the anger, something that looked almost like shame, though she'd done nothing to be ashamed of. "He's wanted this land since James died," Clara said quietly. "Sent a man round within a month of the funeral, if you can believe that. Made an offer so low it was near an insult, and when I refused, he waited. Waited and waited, thinking grief would wear me down eventually, thinking I'd sell just to be rid of the memory of trying to run this place alone." "You didn't sell." "No." Something fierce flickered behind her eyes. "I will not." "He mentioned a railroad." Clara's head came up sharp. "What?" "Didn't say it outright, but a man doesn't get that hungry for a little sewing shop and a half-acre of yard unless there's something coming that makes the ground under it worth more than anybody's telling you." Clara sat down slow, like the weight of it had finally caught up to her legs. "I hadn't heard anything about a railroad." "Maybe that's the point," Ethan said. "Maybe you're not supposed to hear about it till it's too late to matter." They sat with that for a long moment, the lantern burning steady between them, and Ethan watched something shift in Clara's face, fear giving way slowly, deliberately to something harder. "Then I suppose I'd better find out," she said, "before he decides for me." That was the first mini-victory, and it didn't stay quiet for long. 2 days later in the saloon, a Riverside hand named Cooper made the mistake of repeating what he'd heard at the bar that Walter Grayson had been telling anyone who'd listen, that the drifter working Cobb's fence line was the same Ethan Walker who'd run from a horse race back east, after crippling another rider and leaving him to die in the dirt. Ethan was 3 tables away when he heard it. Heard his own name, twisted into something ugly. Something that wasn't true. The man hadn't died, hadn't been left. Ethan had stayed, had carried him himself, had paid for the doctor out of his own pocket for 6 months after. But the truth rarely traveled as fast as a good rumor, and by the time Ethan crossed the room, Half the saloon had already gone quiet, watching. "Say that again?" Ethan said low. Cooper's face went pale. "Ain't my words, Walker, I'm just saying what I heard." "Then unhear it, and whoever told you, you tell them to come say it to my face instead of hiding behind Grayson's coin." The room stayed silent a beat too long. Then the piano started up again badly, and men went back to their drinks, and Ethan walked out into the night with his hands shaking not from fear, but from the effort of not putting a fist through something. He didn't sleep that night either. The rumor spread anyway. By the end of the week, it had grown teeth. Ethan Walker wasn't just reckless. Now he was dangerous, now. Decent folks were saying maybe Clara Bennett ought to think twice about letting a man like that anywhere near her shop, her home, her good name. Clara heard it from the postmaster's wife, delivered with the particular relish some people reserved for bad news about someone else's happiness. She marched straight to Riverside that same afternoon, something Ethan hadn't seen her do before, hadn't imagined she'd do, and found him mending tack outside the barn, and didn't waste a single word on pleasantries. "Is it true?" Ethan's hands went still on the leather. "Which part?" "Any of it. All of it. Tell me, Ethan, because I would rather hear it from you standing here than from every gossiping woman in this town for the rest of my life." So he told her. The real version. The race his pride the moment he'd pushed his horse past Sense trying to win a purse he didn't even need. The way another rider had gone down when Ethan cut too close, the year he'd spent afterward paying doctor's bills, and sitting at that man's bedside, every chance he got, until the man could walk again, until the man had told him more than once that it wasn't his fault that racing was racing, and accidents happened to every man bold enough to ride hard. "Then why do you carry it like a stone around your neck?" Clara asked, quieter now, some of the fire gone out of her, replaced by something gentler. "Because I could have killed him. Because for 1 second wanting to win mattered more to me than his life did. That kind of thing doesn't wash off a man just because it ended all right." Clara studied him a long moment, and Ethan braced himself, the old familiar bracing of a man expecting to watch someone's opinion of him curdle right in front of his eyes. It didn't curdle. "A man who carries that kind of guilt for years," Clara said slowly, "isn't the man Walter's trying to paint you as. A man like that doesn't have a heart cruel enough to leave anyone behind on a racetrack or anywhere else." Something in Ethan's chest cracked wide open, and for one dangerous second he thought he might do something foolish, reach for her hand, or worse, tell her exactly how much those words meant, how long it had been since anyone had looked past what he'd done to see why it still weighed on him. He didn't do either, just nodded, throat too tight for words, and Clara, God bless her, let the silence be enough. But Walter Grayson wasn't finished. Men who mistook money for power rarely knew when to stop pulling at a thread once they'd started, and 3 days after that, Ethan found out exactly how far Grayson was willing to go. It happened at the bank. Clara had gone in to discuss her modest savings. Nothing unusual until the manager, a nervous little man named Pruitt, who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, informed her that her account had been flagged for review, that certain irregularities had come to light regarding the deed to her property, and that until matters were clarified, withdrawals would be limited. Irregularities. Clara repeated very carefully, the word tasting like poison. "What irregularities?" That is Mr. Grayson's attorney, raised some questions about the original transfer of the land following your husband's passing. Whether the deed was properly... My husband's father built that shop with his own 2 hands 40 years ago, Clara said, voice rising despite herself. There is nothing irregular about a piece of land that's been in my family longer than this bank has existed. I'm only relaying what I was told Mrs. Bennett. Told by whom? Pruitt's silence answered the question well enough. Clara walked out of that bank with her hands balled into fists at her sides, and it was pure chance, or maybe not chance at all, that Ethan was crossing the street at that exact moment, supplies in hand, and saw her face before she saw him. Clara. "He's trying to freeze me out," she said, before he'd even reached her words, coming fast and furious. "Can't buy the land outright, so now he's manufacturing some kind of legal trouble, trying to choke me, till I've got no choice but to sell just to breathe again." "Can he do that?" "I don't know. I don't know the law well enough to fight a man with a lawyer on retainer, and half this town's bank in his pocket. Her voice cracked just once, just enough for Ethan to see how much effort it was costing her to stay standing upright in the middle of the street instead of folding in on herself. 3 years, Ethan. 3 years I've held onto that shop with my own 2 hands, and he thinks he can just— He can't, Ethan said, though he didn't fully believe it himself, not yet. Not while there's people in this town who know the truth and are willing to say it out loud. And how many of those people are left after what he's already done to your name? That landed hard because it was fair, because Ethan didn't have a clean answer for it. That was when Sheriff Thomas Reed found them walking up the street at a pace just short of a jog hat already off face grim, in a way Ethan hadn't seen on him before. "Figured you two would be together," Reed said. "Got something you need to hear, and it ain't good, so brace yourselves." Clara's chin came up steady despite everything. "Say it. Got a wire this morning from a marshal over in Bozeman. Seems Walter Grayson's been doing this dance before. Different town, different widow 3 years back. Bought up her land through the same kind of manufactured legal trouble, cheap as dirt, then sold it 18 months later to a railroad survey company for 4 times what he paid." Reed's jaw was tight. "Woman's name was Sarah Kessler. She left town after. Nobody's heard from her since." The street seemed to go very quiet. "You're saying he's done this before?" Clara said very slowly, like she was testing the shape of the words in her mouth. "I'm saying, I think he's fixing to do it again right here, and you're the one standing in his way." Reed looked between them both, something almost apologetic in his expression. "I'd have told you sooner, but the wire only came in an hour ago, and I came straight to find you both the second I read it." "Then we have proof," Ethan said. "Proof of what he did before, proof of a pattern." "We have a wire from a marshal about a different case in a different county," Reed said. "That's a thread, Walker, not a rope. Enough to make me suspicious as hell, not enough to stand up in front of a judge and stop a man with Grayson's money and Grayson's lawyers." "Then what do we do?" Clara asked, and for the first time since Ethan had known her, her voice had a thin edge of real fear in it. Not for herself, he realized, but for the shop, for the last piece of the life she'd built with James and Mary Grace, the last physical thing tying her to the family she'd lost. "We find the rest of the rope," Reed said. "And in the meantime, you keep that shop locked tight and you—" He pointed at Ethan. "You watch your back. A man like Grayson doesn't stop at rumors and bank tricks if those don't work fast enough for him." He wasn't wrong. 2 nights later, Ethan woke in the hayloft to the smell of smoke. He was down the ladder and out into the yard before he'd fully processed what his body already knew and found half the Riverside hands already up buckets moving hand to hand, a section of the east fence. The very fence Ethan had ridden past 100 times, the boundary closest to the road into town, engulfed in flame. Deliberate flame, the kind that didn't start from a dropped lantern or a careless spark. "Coal oil," Silas Cobb said grimly once the fire was beaten back to smoking char. "Somebody poured it along the rail and lit it deliberate. Ain't no accident, this." Ethan stood in the acrid smoke hands, blackened heart-hammering, and understood with total clarity that this wasn't really about a fence at all. It was a message. He rode into town before dawn. Didn't bother waiting for a decent hour, and pounded on Clara's door until she opened it in her nightgown and shawl, eyes wide with alarm at finding him there in the dark, smelling of smoke, knuckles split from beating back flames with his bare hands. "Ethan, what happened? Are you hurt?" "Fence burned last night. Deliberate." He watched her face go pale. "I don't think it was really about the fence." Clara's hand came up to her mouth. "He's escalating. I think he's trying to scare me off. Figures if I leave, you'll have one less person standing beside you, one less pair of eyes watching what he does." "Then he doesn't know you very well," Clara said. And there was something fierce and unshaken in the way she said it. Something that steadied Ethan's racing heart more than any amount of reasoning could have. "Does he?" "No, ma'am," Ethan said. "Reckon he doesn't." But even as he said it, even as some stubborn, hopeful part of him meant every word, another part of him, older, wearier. The part that had spent a decade running, rather than risk becoming a burden to anyone who mattered, was already turning over the darker calculation. That every day he stayed was a day Grayson's threats climbed higher. That the fire could have been the barn instead of the fence. That next time, it might not be property that burned. He didn't say any of that to Clara. Not yet. Instead, he stood on her step in the gray pre-dawn light, exhaustion and smoke and fear all tangled together in his chest, and reached for her hand before he'd fully decided to do it just for a moment, just enough to feel her fingers close tight around his steady, despite the trembling he could feel underneath. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, and meant it as a promise, though some cold, honest part of him already suspected that promise might cost more than either of them yet understood. Clara looked up at him, smoke-smudged and stubborn and unafraid, in a way that took his breath clean out of his chest. "Good," she said, "because I'm not letting him win. Not this time. Not while I've still got breath in me to fight." Behind them, 3 streets over, in a house far grander than anything else in Silver Creek, Walter Grayson sat at his desk by lamplight, a fresh set of forged documents drying under his hand, and smiled the small, satisfied smile of a man who had done this dance before, and fully intended to win it again, no matter what or who stood in his way. The ink on those documents was barely dry when Grayson folded them into a leather case and rode out before sunrise for the county courthouse in Bozeman, 40 miles east, a 2-day trip that would put a judge's seal on paper before anyone in Silver Creek even knew to stop him. Clara didn't know that yet. Neither did Ethan. What Ethan knew, standing in the ashy wreckage of the east fence with the sun barely cresting the hills, was that Silas Cobb was walking toward him with a face like a closed door, and that closed doors, in Ethan's long experience of them, rarely opened onto anything good. "Walk with me," Cobb said. Not unkind, just final the way a man sounds when he's already had the conversation with himself a dozen times before he ever says a word of it out loud. They walked toward the barn boots crunching over char, and Cobb didn't waste time getting to it. "Grayson controls near every cattle contract this ranch depends on. Man came to see me yesterday, real polite, real friendly, and told me he'd hate for Riverside's beef to lose its buyers this season on account of who I've got working my fence line." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You firing me? Ooh, I'm telling you what I'm up against." Cobb stopped, turned to face him square. 22 men on this payroll, Walker. 22 families that eat because this ranch sells cattle. I lose those contracts, I don't just lose you. I lose all of them. "So that's a yes." "That's a not yet," Cobb said sharp. "I told Grayson to go to hell if you want the truth of it. Told him I hire who I please, and he can find someone else's herd to bully." Something flickered in the old man's weathered face. Pride, maybe, or just plain stubbornness. "But I won't lie to you and say that pressure's going away. It's going to get worse before it gets better. You need to know that going in." Ethan looked past him toward the black smear of fence, toward the smoke, still curling faint off the last smoldering post. "I know it already," he said quietly. "Fire told me that much." By midday, the whole town knew about the fire, and by midday, the story had already grown a second head uglier than the first, moving mouth to mouth through the mercantile and the church steps and the saloon. The way rot moves through a bad apple barrel fast and impossible to stop once it's started. Heard the drifter said it himself. Insurance scheme maybe, or trying to make the town feel sorry for him. Heard he's the reason Grayson's had to bring in a lawyer at all man's dangerous ask anybody who knew him back east. Heard there's a witness coming. Somebody who saw what really happened at that race. That last one reached Ethan by way of Hank at the livery, who delivered it with the flat, apologetic tone of a man passing along bad news he didn't believe but felt honor-bound to warn a friend about. "Fella showed up on the noon stage," Hank said, not meeting Ethan's eyes. "Calling himself Cyrus Todd. Saying he rode with you back in Wyoming. Saying he saw the accident firsthand and it wasn't the way you tell it." Ethan's stomach dropped clean through the floor. There was no Cyrus Todd at that race. Well, he's telling it different in the saloon right now, and half the town's buying every word on account of Grayson's the one who paid his stage fare out here. Hank finally looked up, and there was real worry in his eyes. "You want my advice, you go hear what he's saying with your own 2 ears. Man like that left to talk unanswered, he'll bury you before sundown." Ethan went. The saloon was fuller than Ethan had ever seen it. At that hour, men crowded 3 deep at the bar, and in the middle of it all stood a wiry, weasel-faced stranger with a whiskey in hand, holding court like he'd been born to it. "Saw it plain as day," the man was saying. Walker there pushed his horse past Sense, cut the other rider off at the rail, sent him down hard, and you know what he did? Kept riding. Didn't so much as look back. Left the man bleeding in the dirt while he collected his purse. That's a lie. The room turned. Ethan stood in the doorway, and every eye in the place swung toward him at once, and for one long suspended second, nobody moved. "That's a damned lie," Ethan said again, stepping fully into the room. "And you know it because you weren't there. There was no Cyrus Todd anywhere near that racetrack." The stranger's smile didn't waver. "Calling me a liar in front of the whole town, Walker bold, for a man who left another rider to die in the mud. He didn't die. He's alive today because I sat at his bedside for 6 months and paid every dollar his doctoring cost. And if you've got the stomach for it, I'll give you his address, and you can write him yourself and ask." Ethan's voice was low-controlled, though his hands had curled to fists at his sides without his permission. "Whatever Grayson's paying you, it isn't worth what you're about to lose when this town finds out you took his money to spit lies in a crowded room." Something flickered across Todd's face, the first crack in the performance, but he covered it fast, laughed it off, turned back to the bar, like Ethan wasn't worth another word. But the damage was already threaded through the room, sunk into faces that had gone hard and doubtful, and Ethan understood, standing there with his fists clenched and his chest burning, that a lie spoken loud enough in a crowded enough room didn't need to be believed by everyone. It only needed to be believed by enough people to make the truth start looking like the thing that needed defending. He walked out without another word. Behind him, the piano started up again, and the room went back to its noise. But something had shifted. Something Ethan could feel clinging to his shoulders, all the way back to Riverside, heavier than the smoke smell that still hadn't quite washed out of his shirt. That night, Clara's shop window shattered. She woke to the sound of it, glass raining onto her workbench. A fist-sized rock, skidding to a stop against a bolt of blue calico, and by the time she'd thrown a shawl over her nightgown and made it to the front room with a lantern held high and shaking in her hand, whoever had thrown it was long gone into the dark. Painted crude across the outside of her door in what looked like axle grease, black and dripping, were 3 words. "Whore. Leave town." Clara stood in her broken doorway, lantern light trembling across those letters, and for the first time in 3 years of grief and gossip and Walter Grayson's slow, grinding campaign against her, she felt something inside her that wasn't sadness or fear. It was fury. Clean, white-hot fury, the kind that burned every soft thing out of a person and left only the hard core underneath. She was still standing there when Ethan arrived, having heard the commotion from a passing Riverside hand who'd seen the broken glass on his way back from a late supper in town, and the sight of him running up her street in the dark, gun already drawn, face carved from stone, was the thing that finally cracked her fury into something else. "Clara, Clara, are you hurt?" "I'm not hurt." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Someone threw a rock through my window and wrote filth on my door, and I am not hurt, but I am done, Ethan. I am done letting that man decide what my life is allowed to look like." Ethan looked past her at the words on the door, and something in his face went very still, very dangerous. "Who? I don't know who threw it. I know who's paying for it to be thrown." Clara's chin lifted defiant, even with her hands still shaking. "This isn't about my land anymore. This is about breaking me down until I'm too tired and too scared to fight back." "Then we don't let him break you down." "We?" Clara repeated, and something complicated moved across her face. Gratitude tangled up with fear. Fear not for herself, but for him, for what standing beside her was already costing him, and would go on costing him the longer this dragged out. "Ethan, that's exactly what I'm afraid of. You standing next to me taking every piece of this that's meant for me too. I chose that. Did you? Or did I choose it for you the night I asked a soaked, exhausted stranger if he'd eaten without once thinking what it might cost him down the road?" Ethan crossed the broken glass without hesitation, took her hands in his steady, despite the tremor still running through her, and held her gaze in the lantern light. "Nobody chose this for me but me," he said. "Every step of it. And I'd choose it again tomorrow, and the day after that, for as long as you'll let me." Clara's breath caught. For one suspended moment, standing in the wreckage of her own front room, something passed between them that neither one of them dared put a name to, yet something too large and too new and too frightening to speak aloud, with axle grease still wet on the door behind her. Sheriff Reed arrived 20 minutes later, roused from his bed, and stood grim-faced, surveying the broken glass and the crude painted words. "I'll find who did this," he said. "But I'll tell you both plain, this is escalating faster than I like, and I don't have the manpower to watch this shop every hour of every night." "Then what do we do?" Clara asked. "You board up that window till I can find you a new pane of glass. And you—" Reed's eyes swung to Ethan, hard, and pointed. "You watch yourself close, because a man who's already burned fence and thrown rocks through windows is a man running low on patience for subtler tricks." He was right to warn him. 2 days later, the subtlety ran out entirely. Ethan was riding the fence line at dusk, checking the mended rails, when 3 riders came up out of the tree line, fast faces half covered with bandanas, and before he'd fully registered what was happening, a fist connected with his jaw and sent him sprawling off Samson into the dirt. He came up fighting years of hard living, giving his body instincts. His mind didn't have time to consult and got in 2 solid hits before a boot caught him in the ribs and put him back down. "Message from Mr. Grayson," one of the men said, voice muffled behind the bandana standing over him, with clear satisfaction. "Leave town. Tonight, or next time it ain't your fence that burns." They rode off before he could get his feet back under him, leaving Ethan on his knees in the dirt, blood running from a split lip, ribs screaming with every breath, and something inside him. Something that had been holding steady through the rumors and the fire and the broken glass finally quietly gave way. He rode back to Riverside slow, favoring his left side, and lay awake that night in the hayloft, with his ribs bound tight in Cobb's spare bandages, staring up at the dark rafters, and made a decision. He was leaving. Not because he was scared, though he was. If he was honest, scared of what came next if he stayed. But because every single thing Grayson's men had touched so far had touched Clara too, one way or another, and Ethan understood lying there in the dark, with his whole body aching, that the only way to stop the fire from spreading further was to remove the fuel that had started it. Him. He was the fuel. If he left, maybe the rumors died down. Maybe the fires stopped. Maybe Grayson's fury found nothing left to burn. He rode into town before first light, before Clara would even be awake. Telling himself it was kinder this way. Telling himself a note would explain what he couldn't say to her face without breaking. Telling himself every coward's story. A man tells himself when leaving feels safer than staying and fighting for something he's terrified he doesn't deserve to keep. He got as far as tying a folded note to her door handle, hand trembling as he wrote it when the door opened before he'd even finished the knot. Clara stood there in the gray pre-dawn light, fully dressed, like she hadn't slept either, like some part of her had known. "Going somewhere, Mr. Walker?" The formality of it hit him harder than a slap. "Clara, don't." Her voice cracked down the middle, fury and heartbreak tangled together so tight he couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "Don't you dare stand on my step with a note in your hand and try to sneak away like a thief in the night. I'm doing this for you. You're doing this to me." She snatched the note from his hand before he could stop her, unfolded it right there in the doorway, and read it in a voice gone thin and shaking. "Clara, I can't keep bringing this trouble to your door. Better I go before it costs you more than it already has. You deserve peace, and I can't give you that as long as I'm standing beside you." She crumpled the paper in her fist. "You coward!" The word landed like a physical blow, harder than anything Grayson's men had managed the night before. "I got jumped last night," Ethan said low raw. 3 of them. Told me next time it wouldn't be the fence that burned. I have spent my whole life running from the damage I do, just by being near people I care about, Clara. and I will not stand here and watch that happen to you. So instead you'll leave and let this town believe every ugly lie Grayson's been paying men to spread about you, and let me stand here alone facing him with the one person who's ever stood beside me without wanting something from me in return." Clara's eyes were wet now, but her voice never wavered. "That's not protecting me, Ethan. That's abandoning me to save yourself the pain of watching me get hurt." "That's not. It's exactly that." She stepped forward close enough that he could see every fierce, furious, heartbroken line of her face. "I buried a husband and a daughter, Ethan Walker. I know precisely what it costs to lose someone, and I would rather stand and fight beside you and lose everything than watch you ride away safe while I stay here broken all over again." The words hit something in Ethan that 3 years of solitary road hadn't managed to reach some final wall he'd built brick by brick since a racetrack in Wyoming. And it came down all at once, all in that gray doorway, with a crumpled note between them. "I don't know how to stay," he admitted, voice cracking. "I've never stayed anywhere long enough to know how." "Then learn," Clara said, fierce and gentle both at once. "Because I am not letting you leave, not today, not like this." He didn't leave. But the town by mid-morning had already begun turning uglier than either of them had braced for. Word of the beating spread fast, twisted the way every story about Ethan had twisted since Grayson set his machine in motion. Not Walker was attacked, but Walker got what was coming to him. Not 3 armed men jumped an unarmed hand, but Drifter finally showed his true colors, probably owed somebody money. By the time Ethan walked into town at noon, ribs still aching, jaw still swollen. Half the street found excuses to cross to the other side rather than pass close by him. He found Sheriff Reed outside the jail, face grim, already having heard. "3 men, you said. You get a look at any of them?" "Bandanas. Couldn't say who." "Convenient," Reed muttered, though not unkindly. "I'll ask around, but I won't lie to you, Walker. I've got half this town looking at you like you're the trouble instead of the one trouble's been done to. Grayson's done his work well." "Then we do something about it." "With what?" Reed's frustration finally cracked through his usual steady calm. "A wire about a different case in a different county, a beating with no witnesses who'll admit to seeing it. Grayson's smart. He's covered every track that matters." It was Clara, standing beside them, arms crossed, jaw set, who spoke next. "Then we stop playing his game quiet," she said. "He wants this fought in whispers and shadows because that's where he wins. So we drag it into the daylight instead." Reed looked at her. "What are you proposing?" "Town meeting," Clara said. "Tonight. The whole of Silver Creek in the church hall where Walter Grayson can say every ugly thing he's been saying behind our backs, to our faces, in front of witnesses, where he can't hide behind rumor and paid liars." "That's a hell of a risk," Reed said. "So is standing quiet and watching him win," Clara answered. By evening, word had spread that Clara Bennett intended to address the town directly regarding Walter Grayson, and curiosity alone was enough to fill the church hall, past capacity, every pew packed, men standing 3 deep along the back wall. The air thick with the particular electric hush of a town that sensed a real fight was about to happen in front of them instead of behind closed doors. Walter Grayson arrived last, deliberately dressed sharp as ever, and took a position near the front, with the easy confidence of a man who had never once lost a fight he'd bothered to show up for. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "I understand you called this gathering. I'm curious what you imagine it will accomplish." Clara stood at the front of the hall, and Ethan watched her take a breath, watched her spine straighten. Watched 3 years of grief and fear and careful, quiet survival gather itself into something that finally refused to stay small any longer. "I called it," Clara said, voice carrying clear to the back wall, "because I am tired, Mr. Grayson, of you deciding my life from the shadows. I am tired of rocks through my window, and lies about a good man's character, and forged papers meant to steal a home my husband's family built with their own hands. So I thought we'd have this conversation properly. In the light, where everyone can see exactly who you are." A murmur ran through the crowd. Grayson's smile didn't slip, not yet, but something tightened at the corner of his eyes. Bold words for a woman about to lose her property to a legitimate legal review. There is nothing legitimate about it, Clara shot back. And you know it, same as I know you paid a stranger named Cyrus Todd to stand in a saloon and lie about a man's character for the price of a stage ticket. A ripple went through the room. Todd's name meant something now, and more than a few faces turned toward the back of the hall, toward the corner, where the wiry stranger had apparently thought better of showing his face at all tonight. Accusations, Grayson said smoothly, are not proof, Mrs. Bennet. No, Clara agreed. But they add up, don't they, Mr. Grayson? A pattern. Same as the one a marshal over in Bozeman wired Sheriff Reed about 3 days ago regarding a widow named Sarah Kessler, and a piece of land you bought from her cheap right before it sold to a railroad survey company for 4 times the price. The room went dead silent. Grayson's mask finally cracked just at the edges, just enough for those close enough to see it. That is an entirely unrelated matter. Is it? Sheriff Reed stepped forward now, unfolding a paper from his coat, and the crowd's attention swung to him like iron filings to a magnet. Because the description in this wire manufactured deed irregularities sudden bank scrutiny, a mysterious witness paid to smear the victim's character reads awful close to what's happened here in the last 2 weeks. Coincidence, Grayson said, but his voice had lost some of its polish. Maybe, read aloud. Or maybe a judge in Bozeman would find it worth his time to look real close at both cases side by side and see just how much coincidence he's willing to swallow. Grayson's eyes swept the room, and for the first time since Ethan had met him, something like real uncertainty flickered across that carefully composed face. The look of a man realizing in real time that a plan he'd executed cleanly before might not survive contact with a town that had finally decided to look at him with open eyes instead of averted ones. This is absurd, Grayson said louder now, reaching for control of the room. A widow's sentimental attachment to a shop and a drifter's wounded pride dressed up as some grand conspiracy. I have done nothing but pursue legitimate business interests in this town. You hired men to beat me on that fence line 2 nights past. Ethan said, stepping forward for the first time, voice carrying flat and hard across the hushed room. 3 of them bandanas over their faces, telling me to leave town, or next time it wouldn't be the fence that burned. I didn't see faces, Grayson. But I know money when I smell it, and your men reeked of your particular brand. Slander, Grayson snapped. Truth, Ethan said. And you know it, same as everyone standing in this room is starting to know it too. He felt the room's attention on him now, heavy assessing, and braced himself for the same doubt he'd been swimming through for 2 straight weeks. The whispers, the crossed streets, the careful distance people had started keeping. But something had shifted. Clara's words, Reed's wire, the simple plain fact of Ethan standing there, battered and unashamed, and telling the truth to a room that had until tonight mostly heard him through the distorted filter of Grayson's paid lies. It was working some kind of change in the room's temperature, subtle but unmistakable. A person, Clara said, stepping forward again, voice ringing clear through the hall, is not defined by the worst day of their life or the worst lie somebody powerful enough decides to tell about them. What matters is what they choose after. Ethan Walker chose after a mistake that haunts him still to spend 6 months and every dollar he had making that mistake right. He chose to fix a stranger's broken saddle strap in a storm and ask nothing in return. He chose to fix my fence and sit at my table and stand beside me when half this town decided it was safer to whisper about us than to ask either of us the truth. Her voice cracked just slightly, and she let the whole room see exactly how much this cost her to say out loud. I am done letting fear decide who I'm allowed to care about. And I am done letting this town's silence protect a man who has done far worse than anything he's accused either of us of. The hall stayed silent for one long suspended breath. Then from the back of the room, an old man Ethan recognized vaguely as a longtime rancher named Otis Pruitt. No relation, it turned out later, to the nervous bank manager. Though the shared name would cause some confusion for weeks, cleared his throat and spoke up, voice rough with age, but carrying clear. "I sold Grayson a stretch of my north grazing land 2 years back," Otis said. "Cheap on account of some paperwork trouble the bank claimed had turned up. Never thought twice about it till tonight." He looked around the hall, something dawning slow and furious behind his weathered eyes. "By God, it's the same trick, ain't it? He's done this to more of us than just Sarah Kessler." The room erupted into overlapping voices, and Ethan watched Walter Grayson's careful composure finally fully crack. Watched the man realize in real time that the ground he'd built his whole scheme upon silence. Fear-isolated victims, too ashamed or too scared to compare notes, had just given way beneath him in front of the entire town. "This is a witch hunt," Grayson snapped, backing toward the door. "And I will not stand here and be slandered by a widow with delusions and a drifter with a criminal past." "Sit down, Walter," Sheriff Reed said, and there was nothing polite left in his voice at all. "Sit down, or I will find a reason to make you sit down, and you will not enjoy how I go about it." Grayson didn't sit down. He turned and walked out of that church hall, fast coattails snapping, leaving behind a room buzzing with fury and revelation, and the particular electric energy of a town that had just watched its own blindness get dragged into the light. Clara stood at the front of the hall chest, heaving hands trembling, now that the words were finally out, and Ethan crossed to her without thinking twice about who was watching, took her hands in both of his, and held on. "You did that," he said low, just for her. "You just took that whole room apart with nothing but the truth." "We did that?" Clara corrected, breathless, something bright and fierce and finally blessedly hopeful moving behind her eyes. "Together." But even as the hall buzzed around them, even as neighbors who'd whispered ugly things about Clara for 2 straight weeks now pressed forward to apologize, to offer support, to share their own suspicions about deals gone strange with Walter Grayson over the years, Sheriff Reed's face stayed grim, unsatisfied, already 3 steps ahead of the celebration filling the room. "This isn't over," he said quietly, drawing Ethan and Clara aside as the crowd's noise rose around them. "A man like Grayson, cornered in public like that, humiliated in front of the whole town, he's not going to slink off and accept defeat quiet. Man like that gets more dangerous, not less, once he's got nothing left to lose." "What do you mean?" Clara asked. "I mean, he rode out of town 3 days back," Reed said, "and Hank tells me he took the road toward Bozeman, toward the county courthouse." His jaw tightened. "If he's filing those forged documents before a judge who doesn't know any better, tonight's little victory in this church hall doesn't mean a thing. Paper filed and sealed is paper a whole town's outrage can't touch." Clara's face went pale, the triumph of moments before draining fast into something colder, more urgent. "How long would that take, filing something like that?" "Depends on the judge's schedule," Reed said. "Could be done already for all I know. Could be tomorrow morning." He looked between them, both grim and unflinching. "Either way, we're out of time to celebrate. If we don't get proof of what he's done, real proof enough to stop that filing or overturn it after the fact before he gets that judge's seal on paper, none of what happened in this hall tonight is going to matter one bit." Outside the church hall, the night had gone cold, and still stars sharp overhead, and somewhere on the road to Bozeman, 40 miles east, Walter Grayson rode hard through the dark documents secured in his saddlebag, already rehearsing exactly what he'd say, to make a small-town judge sign away Clara Bennett's home, without asking a single question that might slow him down. They didn't wait for morning. "I'm going after him," Ethan said, already moving toward the door of the church hall, "tonight before he reaches that courthouse." "You're not going alone." Clara caught his arm, and there was no room for argument in her grip. "I have as much right to stand in front of that judge as you do. More. It's my name on that deed. Neither of you is riding 40 miles of night road without a badge backing you." Sheriff Reed cut in, already pulling his hat down tight. "I'll deputize you both temporary, gives you legal standing to present evidence direct to the judge, instead of waiting on paperwork through proper channels. But we go together, and we go fast, because Grayson's got a 2-hour head start already, and every minute we stand here arguing about it is a minute he uses." "Then let's stop arguing," Clara said. They didn't have proof yet. Not real proof, not the kind that could stop a judge's pen from moving across a line. What they had was a church hall full of righteous anger, and one marshal's wire about a different woman in a different county. and Reed knew better than either of them that righteous anger didn't hold up in front of a magistrate who'd never laid eyes on Walter Grayson's particular brand of charm. "Otis," Reed said, turning to the old rancher who was still standing near the front of the hall, shaken and furious in equal measure. "That paperwork trouble the bank claimed came up on your north grazing land. You still have the letter they sent you. Home in my desk drawer. Never threw it out, figured it might matter someday, though I never guessed how. Get it, bring it to the jail inside the hour." Reed's eyes swept the room, landing on faces he'd known his whole career, farmers and shopkeepers who'd just watched their town's quiet complicity crack open in front of them. "Anybody else in here ever sold land to Grayson quick cheap, on account of some paperwork trouble that showed up sudden out of nowhere? I want you at my office tonight. Every piece of paper you've got. This is our window, and it's closing fast." The hall emptied in a hurry, people scattering toward homes and desk drawers and dusty boxes of old correspondence, and Ethan felt something shift in the air, not just urgency now, but purpose. A whole town, waking up at once to a threat it had been sleepwalking past for years. But the biggest piece still sat 3 streets away, behind a locked bank door, in the nervous sweating custody of a man named Pruitt. Ethan reached the banker's house first, pounding on the door hard enough to rattle the frame, and when Pruitt opened it in his nightshirt candle, shaking in his hand, his face went the color of old paper. "Mr. Walker, it's the middle of the... I know what time it is. I know what you did to Mrs. Bennett's account, and I know Grayson's the one who told you to do it." Ethan kept his voice low-controlled, though every second felt like sand running out of an hourglass. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to ask you, plain, are you going to keep protecting a man who's about to steal a widow's home out from under her, or are you going to do the one decent thing you've got left in you tonight?" Pruitt's hand trembled so hard the candle flame nearly went out. "You don't understand what he'd do to me. He holds the note on this house, Mr. Walker. He holds notes on half this town. If I cross him..." "If you don't cross him," Clara said, stepping up beside Ethan, voice gentler than Ethan's, but no less unyielding, "you're going to spend the rest of your life knowing you had the chance to stop this, and you chose your own comfort over what was right. I don't think you're a bad man, Mr. Pruitt. I think you're a frightened one. But frightened men can still choose to be brave just this once, when it matters most." Something in Pruitt's face crumpled, and for a moment Ethan thought the man might simply shut the door and leave them standing there. Instead, he set the candle down with a shaking hand and disappeared back into the house, returning minutes later with a leather folder clutched to his chest like it might burn him. "He came to me 3 weeks ago," Pruitt said, voice barely above a whisper. "Told me to flag the account manufacturer review, said it wouldn't matter, because the deed transfer would be finalized before anyone thought to question it. I have his instructions in writing. He was careless. Mr. Walker. Arrogant never thought a small-town banker would keep a record of anything." He held the folder out, hands still shaking, but his spine had straightened. Some, like the act of finally speaking the truth aloud, had put something back into him that fear had been slowly stealing for weeks. "This is everything. Every irregular request he's made of this bank in the past 3 years. God help me, I should have said something long before tonight." "You're saying something now," Clara said. "That's what matters." They rode for the jail with that folder pressed tight against Ethan's chest, and by the time they reached Reed's office, the small room was already crowded. Otis Pruitt, with his letter. 2 other ranchers, with their own stories of sudden paperwork trouble and suspiciously cheap sales. A widow named Margaret Holt, who'd sold Grayson a parcel of timberland 18 months back, under circumstances that laid out now, beside everyone else's stories, looked less like coincidence and more like a pattern carved deliberate and cruel. Reed spread it all across his desk, working fast, matching dates, matching handwriting, matching the particular cruel rhythm of Grayson's method. Sudden legal trouble, a lowball offer delivered with false sympathy, a target too grieved or too frightened or too isolated to fight back alone. "This is it," Reed said, finally looking up, something grim and satisfied moving behind his tired eyes. "This is enough. Judge sees this laid out together instead of scattered piecemeal across 3 counties. He's not signing anything for Grayson tonight. Not without asking a whole lot of hard questions first. Then we ride." Ethan said. "We ride," Reed agreed, already gathering the papers into a saddlebag. "All three of us. I'll wire ahead to the Bozeman marshal, but a wire's only worth as much as whoever's manning the telegraph office tonight, and I wouldn't put it past Grayson to have already made sure that particular door stays shut till morning." He was right to worry. The telegraph operator, a nervous young man named Collins, met them at the door of his office with an apology already halfway out of his mouth. "Line's down east of here, Sheriff. Storm damage from 2 nights back. Ain't had time to send a man out to fix it. Wired Bozeman early this evening before it went, but I couldn't say for certain the message got through clean before the line dropped." Reed's jaw tightened. "So we can't know if the judge has already heard anything from us, or if Grayson's the only voice reaching him tonight." "No, sir. I'm sorry." "Not your fault. Storm." Reed turned back to Ethan and Clara, and there was nothing left in his face but grim determination. "Then we ride hard, and we pray we beat him there, or at least beat whatever paper he's trying to push through before the judge has cause to slow down and ask questions." They left within the hour, 3 horses pushed to a pace that bordered on reckless. The night sky wide and star-scattered above them, the road to Bozeman stretching dark and uncertain ahead. Ethan rode close beside Clara the whole way, watching her posture in the saddle steady, despite the exhaustion visibly gathering in the set of her shoulders, and felt something in his chest that was equal parts pride and fear. Pride at her unbending resolve, fear at everything that could still go wrong before this night was through. They lost time twice. Once, when Clara's mare threw a shoe on a rocky stretch of trail, and they had to slow to a careful walk for nearly a mile before finding ground safe enough to push the pace again. Once, when a sudden squall rolled through just past midnight, not the violent storm that had first brought Ethan to Silver Creek, but bad enough to force them to shelter under a rock overhang for the better part of an hour, watching lightning flicker across a black sky. Clara's hand finding his in the dark without either of them commenting on it. "We're not going to make it in time," Clara said quietly, watching rain sheet down past the overhang. "Are we?" "We don't know that." "Ethan." Her voice cracked just slightly, the accumulated weight of the whole long night finally pressing through her carefully held composure. "If he gets that judge's signature before we arrive, it's done, isn't it? No amount of evidence undoes a filed deed." Ethan turned to face her, fully rain dripping off the rock overhang between them, and took both her hands in his. "Then we ride faster the second this rain lets up. And if we're too late for the filing, we fight it after in front of every judge and every marshal in this territory for as long as it takes. I am not letting that man win, Clara. Not after everything you've already survived to get here." She looked at him, a long moment. Exhaustion and fear, and something else entirely moving behind her eyes, something that had been building steady between them since a lantern-lit shop and a bowl of stew on a stormy night weeks ago. "I believe you," she said finally. "God help me, I believe you." The rain broke just after 2 in the morning, and they rode the last 15 miles at a pace that left all 3 horses lathered and blowing hard, Bozeman's scattered lights finally rising into view against the horizon, just as the eastern sky began faintly to gray toward dawn. They found the courthouse dark, and locked no sign of Grayson. No sign of any judge willing to conduct business at this ungodly hour, and for one heart-stopping moment, Ethan feared they'd ridden all this way only to have no idea where their enemy actually stood. It was Reed banging on the door of the small hotel across the square, who finally shook the answer loose from a bleary desk clerk. "Fella matching that description checked in near midnight," the clerk said, squinting at them through a lamp held too close to his face. "Paid extra to have the judge roused early. Said it was urgent county business." "Judge's chambers," Reed said. "Now, before Grayson gets a private audience without a soul in the room to contradict him." They found Judge Elias Whitfield's chambers on the 2nd floor of the courthouse lamplight, glowing beneath the door, and the sound of Grayson's voice, smooth and practiced, drifting through the wood. "A straightforward transfer, Your Honor. The widow's finances have grown untenable, given her husband's outstanding debts, and I've simply offered a fair market solution to a difficult situation." Reed didn't knock. He threw the door open, and the room's 3 occupants, a startled robe-clad judge, a clerk half asleep in the corner, and Walter Grayson himself, papers spread across the desk before him, turned as one toward the sudden intrusion. "Sheriff Reed." Grayson's composure cracked just for an instant before sliding back into place like a mask settling. "This is a private legal matter, and you have no jurisdiction." "I have every jurisdiction that matters," Reed said, striding into the room, saddlebag heavy in his hand. "And Judge, before you put your seal on anything, this man's put in front of you. I'd ask you kindly to look at what I've brought instead." Judge Whitfield, a thin, sharp-eyed man who looked considerably less amused at being roused before dawn than Grayson had apparently hoped, held up a hand. "Mr. Grayson, if there's a dispute here—" "There's no dispute, Your Honor. Merely an inconvenienced sheriff who's ridden through the night on a fool's errand." "Then you won't mind me looking at his fool's errand before I sign anything of yours," Whitfield said, not unkindly, but with the particular firmness of a man who had built his entire career on refusing to be rushed. Reed spread the contents of the saddlebag across the desk. Pruitt's confession, the marshal's wire about Sarah Kessler, Otis's letter, Margaret Holt's timberland, papers, a growing pile of evidence that painted laid out together under lamplight an unmistakable pattern no reasonable judge could ignore. Whitfield read in silence for what felt to Ethan like an eternity, occasionally glancing up at Grayson, whose face had gone increasingly rigid with each passing minute, the polished charm finally visibly failing him. "Mr. Grayson," Whitfield said, finally setting the last paper down, "would you care to explain why a bank manager in Silver Creek has documented in his own hand receiving direct instructions from you to manufacture a fraudulent account review against Mrs. Bennett? That document is forged. This is clearly a conspiracy." "And would you care to explain," Whitfield continued, voice hardening, "why the pattern of your land acquisitions in this territory bears such a striking resemblance to a case a marshal in this very county investigated regarding a Mrs. Sarah Kessler 3 years past? Coincidence? 3 coincidences, Mr. Grayson, in a folder that thick start to look a great deal like a habit." Whitfield removed his spectacles, rubbed his eyes, looked considerably more awake than he had 5 minutes ago. "I am not signing anything tonight regarding Mrs. Bennett's property. In fact, given what I'm reading here, I believe this matter warrants a full county investigation, and I would strongly suggest, Mr. Grayson, that you retain competent legal counsel of your own, because it appears you are about to need it considerably more than the widow you came here to dispossess." The room went utterly silent. Grayson stood very still, and Ethan watched something break behind the man's carefully composed eyes. Not remorse, nothing so simple as that, but the particular cold fury of a man watching a scheme he'd executed cleanly before finally irrevocably collapse in front of witnesses he could no longer buy or intimidate into silence. "This is not over," Grayson said, low, venomous, looking past the judge directly at Clara and Ethan standing in the doorway. "You think a church hall full of gossiping farmers and one nervous banker's confession is going to stop me? I have resources you cannot begin to imagine." "You had resources," Reed cut in, stepping forward, hand resting easy but deliberate near his sidearm. "Right about now, Walter, I believe what you've actually got is a county judge who's seen your pattern laid bare, a bank record proving fraud, and a marshal in Bozeman who's about to get a very interesting piece of mail regarding a widow named Sarah Kessler. I'd say your resources are looking considerably thinner than they were an hour ago." Grayson's eyes swept the room one final time, the judge's unmoved expression, Reed's steady readiness, Clara standing tall in the doorway with Ethan just beside her, and something in his face finally fully cracked the mask, sliding away entirely to reveal the cold, calculating fury that had been sitting underneath it all along. He lunged for the door. It happened fast. Grayson shoving past the desk, knocking papers scattering across the floor, making a desperate break for the hallway beyond. But Ethan was faster, closing the distance in 2 long strides and catching the man's arm before he'd made it past the threshold, spinning him hard against the doorframe. "Going somewhere," Ethan said, low, dangerous, every ounce of restraint he'd been holding for 2 straight weeks of burned fences and broken glass and split lips finally straining against the leash he kept on it. "Get your hands off me," Grayson spat. Struggling, but Ethan's grip didn't loosen an inch. Walker. Reed's voice, calm but firm, cut through the moment. Let the law handle it from here. Ethan held on 1 second longer than strictly necessary, just long enough to look Grayson dead in the eye and let the man see exactly how close he'd come to a different kind of reckoning entirely before releasing him into Reed's waiting grip. Walter Grayson, Reed said, snapping a set of cuffs around the man's wrists with brisk, practiced efficiency. You're under arrest pending full investigation into fraud, forgery, and conspiracy on charges I expect are about to grow considerably longer once the Bozeman Marshal's had his own look at what's in that saddlebag. You have no idea what you've just done, Grayson snarled as Reed marched him toward the door. No idea the trouble you've invited. I reckon I've got a fair idea, Reed said, unbothered. Same trouble that comes for any man who spends years thinking he's above the rules the rest of us live by. Just took a while for the bill to come due is all. They led him out into the graying dawn light, and Clara stood in the courthouse doorway watching him go, and Ethan watched her face carefully braced for tears, for collapse, for the delayed reckoning of everything she'd carried through this impossible night. Instead, something in her shoulders finally visibly loosened, 3 years of held tension unwinding all at once. It's over, she said, disbelieving like she couldn't quite trust the words even as she spoke them. Ethan, it's actually over. It's over, he confirmed, and pulled her into his arms, right there in the courthouse doorway, not caring who saw, not caring that Judge Whitfield was watching with mild, knowing amusement from his chambers behind them. You did it. You beat him. We did it, Clara said, again, insistent, her face pressed against his shoulder, and Ethan felt something in his own chest finally fully release as well. Some knot he'd been carrying since a racetrack in Wyoming, some old certainty that he brought only trouble to the people who let him close, finally loosening its grip after 10 long years of holding tight. They rode back to Silver Creek slower than they'd ridden out, the urgency drained clean out of the journey, replaced by something quieter. Something that felt for the first time in weeks, almost like peace. Sheriff Reed stayed behind in Bozeman to see Grayson properly processed, and to send his own wire to the marshal regarding Sarah Kessler, promising to follow within the day. And so it was just Ethan and Clara riding the last stretch of road together as the sun climbed full into a clear morning sky. What happens to the shop now? Ethan asked somewhere past the halfway point when the silence between them had stretched comfortable and easy. It's mine, Clara said, and there was wonder in her voice, like she was only now allowing herself to fully believe it. Truly mine. No forged papers, no manufactured debts, no shadow hanging over it anymore. She glanced over at him, something softer moving behind her eyes. I keep thinking about that first night. The storm. You knocking on my door soaked to the bone asking to borrow a needle. I keep thinking about it too. I almost didn't answer, Clara admitted. Stood behind that door a full minute deciding whether to open it at all. If I hadn't, you would have been fine, Ethan said. You didn't need me, Clara. You beat Grayson with your own courage, your own town rallying around you, your own refusal to stay quiet. I was just lucky enough to be standing beside you when it happened. That's not true, and you know it. Clara's voice went firm. You stood beside me when the whole town was whispering about you. You took a beating meant to scare you off and rode straight back into town instead of running. You told the truth about your own worst day in front of a packed church hall because you thought it might help me, even knowing what it would cost you to say it out loud. She reached over, closing the distance between their horses, and took his hand. Don't you dare shrink your part in this, Ethan Walker. Not after everything. He didn't have an answer for that. Not one that didn't threaten to crack his voice wide open. So he simply held her hand the rest of the way into town, the morning sun warm on their backs. Silver Creek's familiar rooftops rising slowly into view ahead. They found Silas Cobb waiting at the edge of town, having heard some garbled version of the night's events already traveling ahead of them, and the old rancher's weathered face broke into something almost like a smile at the sight of them both riding in together, unharmed, triumphant. Judge throw the book at him? Cobb asked. Arrested, Ethan confirmed. Pending investigation. Reed's staying behind to see it done proper. Good. Cobb spat to the side, satisfaction plain on his face. Man's had this coming a long while. Glad it's finally caught up to him. He looked between them both, something almost fatherly in his gruff expression. You did good, Walker, both of you. This town's better for it. Word spread fast, the way it always did in Silver Creek, and by midday, the whole town seemed to know. Walter Grayson arrested his scheme, exposed Clara Bennett's shop, safe and clear of any claim against it. The same street that had crossed to avoid Ethan 2 weeks past now found excuses to stop him, to shake his hand, to offer the particular sheepish apologies of people who'd let fear and rumor make their decisions for them, and were only now finding the courage to admit it. It was mid-afternoon, sitting at Clara's kitchen table over coffee. Neither of them had the energy to properly drink, exhaustion from the long night finally catching up to them both, when the postmaster arrived at the shop door with a letter for Ethan, forwarded from 3 towns back, along a chain of addresses he'd left behind him over the years without ever quite expecting anyone to write. Been chasing you a while, this one, the postmaster said, handing it over. Postmarks from Wyoming. Ethan's hands went very still. Ethan. Clara watched his face change, watched the color drain slightly from it. What is it? He didn't answer right away, just stared at the return address, a name he hadn't let himself think about directly in longer than he could account for. Daniel Whitmore, the rider from the race. The one who'd gone down hard in the dirt, while Ethan rode on ahead, chasing a purse he hadn't needed, learning, in the worst possible way, exactly what his own pride could cost someone else. Open it, Clara said gently, setting her coffee aside, reaching across the table to take his free hand. Ethan's fingers shook slightly as he broke the seal, unfolded the single page inside, and began to read. Clara, watching his face the whole while, watching something complicated move across it. Dread, then confusion, then something that looked almost like disbelief. What does it say? Ethan's voice, when it finally came, was rough, unsteady in a way Clara had never heard from him before. He's walking again, Ethan said. Fully recovered, near 2 years now, married. Got a boy on the way come spring. He swallowed hard, eyes still fixed on the page. Says he's been meaning to write for a long while, just never knew where to send it till a fella passing through Wyoming mentioned running into a horseman named Walker working cattle up in Montana, and Daniel figured it was worth trying the postmaster's chain to see if it found me. Ethan! Clara's hand tightened around his. What does he say? Ethan read the last lines aloud, voice cracking clean in two by the final sentence. I forgave you a long time ago, Ethan. Forgave you before I could even walk again, if I'm honest. It was a race. Men push too hard in races, that's just the truth of it. And what happened wasn't cruelty. It was an accident, the kind that could have happened to either of us on a given day. You paid for every doctor I ever saw, and sat with me through the worst of it when you didn't have to, when most men would have run and never looked back. I've thought of you, often wondered if the guilt ever let you rest. I hope this letter finds you and does what I should have written years sooner to do, set that guilt down, Ethan. You've carried it long enough. Come see us sometime if the road ever brings you back this way. My boy's going to need someone to teach him to ride, and I can't think of a better man for the job. Ethan set the letter down on the table, hands trembling. And for a long moment, he simply sat there, staring at nothing. 10 years of carried weight, finally fully cracking loose all at once. Clara didn't say anything, didn't rush to fill the silence with comfort or reassurance. She simply moved around the table, knelt beside his chair, and wrapped her arms around him, letting him break in whatever way he needed to break right there in her kitchen, in the afterlight of everything they'd both survived together. He forgave me, Ethan said, voice muffled against her shoulder, disbelieving. He forgave me years ago, and I spent all that time running from something that wasn't even chasing me anymore. Sometimes, Clara said softly, the hardest person to forgive a man is himself. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her eyes wet, something raw and unguarded moving across his face that he'd never once let anyone see before, not in 10 years of careful distance, not in a decade of never staying anywhere long enough to be truly known. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. Set it down. I've carried it so long I don't rightly know who I am without it. Then we'll find out together." Clara said simple and certain, the same steady certainty that had carried her through a church hall full of doubters and a courthouse confrontation with a man who'd tried to steal her whole life out from under her. One day at a time, same as everything else worth having. Outside, the afternoon light slanted warm and gold across Silver Creek's familiar streets, and word continued spreading of Walter Grayson's arrest of Sarah Kessler's case, reopening of a town finally waking up to a truth it had let itself ignore for far too long. But inside the small kitchen behind the sewing shop, none of that mattered nearly as much as two people finally fully setting down the weight they'd each carried alone for far too long, choosing in the quiet aftermath of a night that had nearly broken them both to carry whatever came next together instead. Neither of them noticed in that gentle golden hour that 3 streets over Sheriff Reed had just ridden back into town with news that would complicate everything they thought they'd finally settled. A wire from the Bozeman marshal delivered just before Reed left, informing him that Walter Grayson's lawyer had already filed for an emergency bail hearing, and that a man with Grayson's resources rarely stayed behind bars as long as the law hoped he might. Sheriff Reed found them still sitting in Clara's kitchen, the letter from Daniel Whitmore folded on the table between them, and one look at his face told them both that whatever peace they'd found in the last hour was about to be tested. "Bail hearing," Reed said, without preamble, dropping into the third chair like his legs had finally given out from the long ride. Grayson's lawyer filed before the ink was even dry on the arrest paperwork. Judge Whitfield's setting it for tomorrow morning. Clara's face went pale. "Tomorrow. That's absurdly fast." "Man's got money enough to make things move fast when it suits him." Reed rubbed a hand over his tired eyes. "I won't lie to you both. Fraud and forgery. Those are serious charges, but they're not the kind of charges that automatically keep a man locked up pending trial. Not when he's got deep pockets and a lawyer arguing he's no flight risk on account of his business ties to the territory." "So he could walk," Ethan said flat. "He could walk," Reed confirmed. "Judge might set bail high enough to sting, might attach conditions, stay clear of Silver Creek, stay clear of you two specifically. But I've seen men like Grayson before. Conditions on paper don't always translate to conditions a man actually respects, especially not one who's just watched his whole scheme come apart in front of a room full of witnesses." Clara's hand found Ethan's under the table, gripping tight. "Then what do we do?" "Tonight, you do nothing but rest," Reed said, gentler now. "You've both been up the better part of 2 days straight. Tomorrow I ride back to Bozeman for the hearing, and I'll argue every reason I've got for that judge to keep him locked up tight. But I wanted you to hear it from me first, plain, rather than have some traveler bring you a garbled version secondhand." He left them with that, and the golden afternoon that had felt an hour ago like the beginning of something safe and settled now carried an undercurrent Ethan recognized all too well, the particular unease of a fight that wasn't quite finished, no matter how badly both of them needed it to be. Clara didn't sleep well that night. Ethan knew it because he didn't either. Lying in the hayloft at Riverside with his mind circling the same worry over and over, that a man like Grayson humiliated in front of an entire town, stripped of the respectability he'd spent years building, wasn't the kind of man who slunk quietly away from a fight he'd lost. Men like that got meaner when they were cornered, not smaller. He was proven right faster than he wanted to be. The wire came the next evening, carried by a breathless young rider Reed had stationed in Bozeman, specifically to send word the moment the hearing concluded. And Ethan was at Clara's shop when the boy pounded up the street and thrust the paper into her hands. Clara read it twice before she spoke, her face unreadable in the lamplight. "Bail granted," she said finally. $10,000, conditions attached, he's to stay outside Silver Creek Township, limits pending trial, surrender. His travel documents report weekly to the Bozeman Marshal's office. She looked up at Ethan, something hard and frightened moving behind her eyes. He paid it in full. Cash on the spot. Walked out of that courthouse 2 hours ago. $10,000 like it was pocket change, Ethan said low. That's not even the worst of it. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she held out the second half of the wire. Reed says witnesses at the courthouse heard him telling his lawyer quiet on the way out that this wasn't finished, that a man doesn't build what he's built by losing to a widow and her drifter. The words landed like a physical blow, and Ethan felt the old cold thread of danger tighten in his gut, the same feeling he'd had standing over a burned fence line 2 weeks past. "He's not supposed to come within the township," Ethan said. "Since when has that man respected a boundary he didn't draw himself?" She wasn't wrong, and they both knew it. 3 days passed in an uneasy quiet, the kind that felt less like peace and more like the held breath before a storm breaks. Ethan split his time between Riverside and Clara's shop, unwilling to let more than a few hours pass without checking on her and Clara. For her part, stopped pretending she didn't want him there. The whole town seemed to feel it too. A watchfulness in the streets, shopkeepers glancing twice at strangers. Sheriff Reed doubling his rounds past the sewing shop every evening without being asked. It was on the 4th night that the watchfulness proved justified. Ethan had stayed later than usual, the two of them sharing a quiet supper that had stretched long into easy conversation, the kind that came naturally now, without the careful distance of those first weeks. He was gathering his hat to head back to Riverside when Clara's hand on his arm stopped him. "Stay a moment," she said. "I want to show you something." She led him to a small trunk in the corner of her bedroom, worn leather gone soft with age, and lifted the lid to reveal folded baby clothes. A woman's wedding dress carefully preserved a small wooden horse that had clearly been carved by loving, unpracticed hands. "James made that for Mary Grace," Clara said quietly, lifting the wooden horse. "Her 3rd birthday. She carried it everywhere for a year straight, wore the paint clean off one side from all the holding." She turned it over in her hands, something tender and aching in her expression. "I haven't opened this trunk in over a year. Couldn't bring myself to." "Why tonight?" Clara looked up at him, and there was something brave and vulnerable in her face that Ethan had rarely seen from her, not even in the church hall, not even facing down Grayson in a courthouse at dawn. "Because for the first time in 3 years," she said, "I don't feel like I'm betraying them by wanting something more than memory. I don't feel like loving you means loving them less." Her voice caught. "I wanted you to see this part of me too, the part that isn't just fighting Walter Grayson, the part that's still learning how to grieve and hope at the same time." Ethan set his hat down, slowly crossed the small room, and knelt beside her at the open trunk. "Thank you," he said, voice rough, "for trusting me with this." It was in that quiet, tender moment, Clara's hand resting light against his jaw, the wooden horse still cradled in her palm, something unspoken finally gently rising to the surface between them, that the front window shattered a second time. Not a rock this time, a bullet. The shot cracked through the night, splintering wood and glass in the front room, and Ethan was moving before conscious thought caught up, shoving Clara flat behind the trunk. His body curved protective over hers, heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. "Stay down," he breathed. "Stay down." A second shot followed the first, embedding somewhere in the far wall with a heavy, splintering thud, and then a voice, slurred and furious, carried in from the street. "Come out, Walker! Come out and face me like a man instead of hiding behind a woman's skirts." Ethan's blood went ice cold. He knew that voice. Grayson. "He's drunk," Clara whispered, terror and fury tangled together in her voice. "Ethan, he's not supposed to be within 50 miles of this town." "I know it." Ethan's jaw was tight, every muscle in his body coiled and ready. "Stay here. Bolt the back door behind me and don't open it for anyone but Reed." "Ethan, no, if he's got a gun." "I'm not leaving you here for him to reach through a broken window," Ethan said, already moving low toward the front room, keeping below the sight line of the shattered glass. "I need you safe, Clara. Please." She caught his hand one last time, fierce and desperate. "Don't you dare die tonight. Not after everything." "I don't intend to," Ethan said, and meant it with every fiber of the 10 years of careful survival that had brought him to this exact room, this exact woman, this exact fight he'd never once imagined himself caring enough to have. He slipped out the back, circling wide through the alley. Clara's fence bordered the same fence he'd mended weeks ago on a quiet Sunday morning that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different life, and came up on the street from the side, keeping to shadow every sense stretched taut. Grayson stood in the middle of the road, swaying slightly, a revolver hanging loose but ready in his hand. His sharp, tailored clothes rumpled and stained every trace of the polished cattle buyer stripped away, to reveal something raw and unhinged underneath. "I know you're out here, Walker," Grayson called, voice cracking with rage and whiskey both. 10 years I built what I built in this territory. 10 years and you and that widow tear it down in a single night over a few sheets of paper and a preacher's daughter's sentimental crusade. Put the gun down, Walter. Grayson spun toward the voice, and Ethan stepped fully into the open street, hands raised showing empty palms, every old instinct in him screaming to reach for his own sidearm, and every hard-won lesson of the last 10 years telling him that drawing on a drunk, desperate man would only end in blood neither of them could take back. "There you are." Grayson's laugh was ugly unsteady. "Brave enough to face me now that your woman's not standing in the doorway. She's not my woman to hide behind or in front of," Ethan said, keeping his voice low, even the same steady tone he'd have used gentling a spooked horse. "This is between you and me, Walter. Put the gun down and let's settle it that way." "Settle it!" Grayson's grip on the revolver tightened, the barrel drifting unsteady, dangerous. "You think there's anything left to settle? I lost everything in that church hall. Every contract, every deal, every scrap of respectability I spent a decade building. And for what, a widow's shop and a drifter's pride. You lost it the day you decided stealing from grieving widows was an acceptable way to build a fortune," Ethan said. "Nobody took that from you, Walter. You built your own ruin one forged paper at a time." "Shut up." The gun came up fully now, leveled at Ethan's chest, and every muscle in Ethan's body went taut. Adrenaline flooding cold and sharp through his veins even as he forced himself to hold perfectly, deliberately still. "Walter." Ethan's voice stayed level, though his heart hammered, fit to break his ribs. "You pull that trigger, there's no bail hearing after. There's no lawyer, no fine, no walking away with your money intact. There's a rope or a cell for the rest of your natural life, and either way, this right here is the last free choice you're ever going to make. Think hard before you make it." For one endless suspended second, the revolver held steady on Ethan's chest. Grayson's finger white-knuckled against the trigger, the whole street holding its breath around them. Then a second voice cut through the dark. "Drop it, Grayson." Sheriff Reed stood at the mouth of the alley, rifle already raised, having heard the shots from 3 streets over and covered the distance at a dead run. Behind him, 2 more figures emerged. Silas Cobb, shotgun in hand, having ridden hard the moment word reached Riverside, and Hank from the livery, armed with nothing but a length of pipe and sheer stubborn courage. Grayson's eyes darted between them, the odds shifting visibly against him, and something in his face crumpled. Not surrender exactly, but the particular collapse of a man realizing all at once that every advantage he'd ever held had finally completely run out. "You're all going to regret this," he said, voice shaking now, the gun beginning to lower almost against his own will. "Every one of you." "Maybe," Reed said, closing the distance, slow and steady, rifle never wavering. "But not tonight, and not on account of you. Drop the gun, Walter. Last time I asked nice." The revolver hit the dirt. Reed had him cuffed within the minute, and this time there was no lawyer, no bail hearing scheduled with suspicious speed, no $10,000 changing hands to buy a man's freedom back. Discharging a firearm in a populated street, violating the explicit terms of his bail attempted assault on 2 named individuals. The charges piled fast and heavy, and even Grayson's money, Reed assured them grimly, wasn't likely to buy his way clear of this one. "He'll sit in a cell till trial this time," Reed said, once Grayson had been marched off toward the jail, the street slowly filling with neighbors, drawn out by the gunshots, faces pale with shock and relief in equal measure. No judge in this territory grants bail twice to a man who used his first chance at freedom to put a bullet through a widow's window. Clara had come running the moment the shooting stopped, and she reached Ethan now, throwing herself against his chest hard enough to nearly knock him off balance, her whole body shaking. "I heard the second shot, and I thought—" Her voice broke entirely. "I thought I'd lost you before I even had the chance to—" "I'm here," Ethan said, wrapping both arms tight around her, feeling his own hands shake now that the danger had passed, and his body was finally catching up to everything it had held steady through. "I'm here, Clara. I'm not going anywhere." She pulled back just enough to look at him, tears streaking her face, and something in her expression had shifted entirely from fear into something fierce and certain, and finished with waiting. "I love you," she said, plain and unguarded, right there in the street with half the town watching. "I have for weeks now, and I was too scared to say it out loud because saying it made it real, made it something I could lose the way I lost James and Mary Grace. But standing here right now, having nearly lost you to that man's bullet, I understand something I should have understood weeks ago. Loving you isn't a betrayal of what I lost. It's proof that I'm still alive enough to risk loving again." Ethan's throat closed so tight he could barely force words past it. "I love you too," he said, voice rough with everything he'd spent 10 years refusing to feel for anyone. "Have since that first night, if I'm honest. Since you asked a soaked, exhausted stranger if he'd eaten like it was the most natural thing in the world. I just didn't have the courage to say it, not carrying what I was carrying. And now, Ethan said, cupping her face in both hands. I reckon I'd rather spend the rest of my life earning the right to stand beside you than spend one more day running from something that's already found me." The trial, when it finally came 3 weeks later, was swift and thorough. Sarah Kessler herself arrived from 2 counties over, summoned by the marshal's office once the pattern of Grayson's schemes became undeniable and her testimony quiet devastating, detailing the same manufactured legal trouble, the same forced sale, the same isolation and fear Clara had so nearly suffered, sealed whatever slim chance Grayson's expensive lawyer had held of arguing reasonable doubt. Otis Pruitt testified. Margaret Holt testified. Even the banker Pruitt appeared before the court visibly terrified but resolute, laying out every fraudulent instruction he'd received and executed under Grayson's direction over 3 long years. Ethan testified too, recounting the beating on the fence line, the burned rails, the bullet through Clara's window, his voice steady even as the memory of that gun leveled at his chest made his hands tremble slightly at the witness stand. Clara's testimony came last, and Ethan watched from the gallery as she stood before the packed courtroom. Word of the scandal had spread far enough that spectators had traveled from 3 counties to watch it unfold, and told her story, plain and unflinching. From the manufactured bank trouble to the axle grease smeared across her door to the bullet that had nearly widowed her a second time before she'd even had the chance to remarry. I am not the first woman Walter Grayson tried to destroy for the sake of profit. Clara said, her voice carrying clear and steady to every corner of the room. But with the help of good people who refuse to look away, I intend to be the last. The jury deliberated less than 2 hours. Guilty on every count. Fraud, forgery, conspiracy, attempted assault, violation of bail. The judge, citing the pattern of victimization spanning years and multiple counties, sentenced Walter Grayson to 20 years in the Territorial Penitentiary, a sentence that drew audible gasps from the gallery and from Grayson himself. Only a final hollow stare directed at Clara and Ethan as the bailiffs led him away. He never spoke to either of them again. The ride back to Silver Creek that afternoon felt different than the desperate, exhausted ride to Bozeman weeks before. Slower. Easier, the weight of the whole ordeal finally fully lifted from both their shoulders. Sheriff Reed rode ahead to spread the news, and by the time Ethan and Clara reached the edge of town, half of Silver Creek had gathered in the street to greet them, cheering, waving the same faces that had once crossed the street to avoid Ethan, now pressing forward to shake his hand, to thank Clara for her courage to apologize, more than a few of them, with real tears in their eyes, for ever having doubted either of them. Otis Pruitt pressed a jar of honey into Clara's hands. Margaret Holt hugged her tight enough to lift her briefly off her feet. Even the postmaster's wife, the very woman who'd first carried Grayson's ugly rumor to Clara's door, came forward with a basket of fresh bread, and an apology so heartfelt, Clara found herself comforting the other woman instead of accepting comfort herself. "Whole town's changed its tune awful fast," Ethan murmured to Clara, watching the celebration swell around them. "People aren't cruel by nature," Clara said, watching the same scene with something gentler than bitterness in her eyes. Mostly they're just afraid, and fear makes cowards of even decent folks sometimes. What matters is, they found their courage before it was too late to matter. Silas Cobb found them both in the crush of the crowd, and there was something almost sentimental in the old rancher's weathered face as he looked between them. Reckon you'll be wanting steady work now. Walker, seeing as you've decided to make Silver Creek your permanent trouble instead of just passing through it. If you'll have me, Ethan said. Long term this time, not just till the roads dry out. Hell, son, I decided you were staying the day you fixed that girl's fence for free. Cobb clapped him on the shoulder, gruff affection plain beneath the rough exterior. There's a foreman's position opening come spring if you're interested. Old Pete's retiring, moving in with his daughter over in Helena. Man who can hold a fence line, hold his temper under fire, and hold a whole town's respect after everything you two just survived, reckon that's exactly the kind of man I want running my operation. Ethan looked to Clara, who was already smiling, already nodding, already 3 steps ahead of him, the way she so often was. I'd be honored, Ethan said. The weeks that followed passed gentler than any stretch of time Ethan could remember in the better part of a decade. He took up the foreman's position at Riverside come spring steady work with steady pay, and spent his evenings the same way he had since that first storm-soaked night, walking the familiar road into town, past the same narrow shop front, toward the same lantern burning gold in the window. Except now, he didn't just pass by. Now he had a key. Clara's shop flourished in the months following the trial business better than it had ever been, partly from simple gratitude, and partly Clara insisted with a wry affectionate smile, because half the county now wanted to meet the widow bold enough to bring down Walter Grayson with nothing but courage and a well-organized folder of evidence. The railroad came through 18 months later, exactly as Grayson had anticipated, cutting a line, not 50 yards from Clara's property, and the land value climbed exactly as high as he'd predicted. Except now, it climbed for Clara's benefit, instead of his funding an expansion of her shop into a proper storefront, with room enough for 2 seamstresses and a growing waiting list of customers from 3 surrounding counties. Sarah Kessler wrote to Clara twice that first year, first to thank her for the courage that had finally brought her own case, the justice it deserved, and later to share news of her own. A modest ranch purchased with restitution funds, a fresh start, finally within reach, after 3 years of believing she'd lost everything for good. Sometimes Sarah wrote in that second letter, "It takes someone else's courage to remind us we still have some of our own left buried somewhere underneath the fear. Thank you for finding yours in time to help me find mine." Clara read that letter aloud to Ethan on the porch of the small house they'd begun slowly and deliberately to share, and folded it carefully away in the same trunk that held Mary Grace's wooden horse, and James's memory, no longer a place of grief kept sealed away, but a place of honored memory, sitting comfortably alongside a life still very much being lived. It was on a warm evening in late autumn, a little over a year after that first storm had driven Ethan Walker to knock on a stranger's door, that he found himself standing in Clara's kitchen. Their kitchen now in most ways that mattered with something small and heavy. Weighing down his coat pocket, his heart hammering harder than it had facing down Walter Grayson's revolver in the middle of a dark street, Clara was at the stove, same as she'd been that very first night, stirring a pot of stew that smelled achingly wonderfully familiar. And Ethan watched her for a long moment from the doorway, memorizing the particular way the lantern light caught the gray threading through her dark hair, the steady, unhurried confidence in every motion of her hands. "You're staring?" Clara said without turning around. "I can feel it. Can't help it," Ethan admitted. "Never get tired of watching you in this kitchen." Flatterer. But she was smiling when she finally turned, and the smile faded into something curious when she saw his face, saw the way he was standing, the particular nervous stillness that had settled over him. "Ethan, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He crossed the small kitchen, closing the distance between them, and reached into his coat pocket with a hand that shook only slightly. "Everything actually is about as right as I ever imagined it could get. Which is a strange thing for a man to say who spent 10 years believing he didn't deserve anything close to right." Clara's eyes went wide as he lowered himself to one knee right there on the kitchen floor, where they'd washed dishes together that very first storm-soaked night, right there beneath the same window, where a lantern still burned every evening. No longer a symbol of loss, but something entirely transformed. Clara Bennett, Ethan said, voice rough with everything he'd carried, and finally fully set down. I spent my whole life searching for a place to belong, riding from one town to the next, never staying long enough for anyone to really know me, because I believed deep down that a man who'd caused the kind of harm I'd caused didn't have the right to ask for a home. Then a storm broke my saddle strap outside your shop, and you opened your door to a stranger, and you asked me the simplest, kindest question anyone had asked me in a decade. You didn't ask what I'd done or where I'd come from or what I might cost you. You just asked if I'd eaten. And in that one small, ordinary kindness, you gave me something I'd stopped believing I deserved a reason to stay. Clara's hands had come up to cover her mouth, tears bright in her eyes. The wooden spoon forgotten and dripping stew onto the floor, neither of them noticed nor cared about. I am not asking you to replace what you lost. Ethan continued, pulling a small ring from his coat pocket. Simple, unadorned, exactly the kind of honest thing he'd have chosen, even if he'd had all the money in the territory to spend on something grander. James and Mary Grace will always have their place in your heart, same as this town, same as this shop, same as that trunk you finally let me see. I'm only asking for the chance to build something new alongside all that. To spend every evening for the rest of my life, walking home to this kitchen, this lantern, this woman who taught me that home was never about a place at all. It was always about being known fully and chosen anyway. Clara Bennett, will you marry me? For a long, breathless moment, Clara simply stood there, tears streaming freely, now her whole body trembling with an emotion too large for words. Then she was on her knees, too, pulling him into her arms with a force that nearly toppled them both, laughing and crying all at once, the particular joyful chaos of a heart that had finally fully healed enough to risk everything on love again. Yes, she said, again and again, pressed against his shoulder. Yes, yes, 1,000 times. Yes, Ethan Walker, you impossible, wonderful, redeemed man. They were married the following spring in the small church that had once hosted the town meeting, where Clara stood before a packed hall and refused to let fear decide her life any longer. Sheriff Reed stood as Ethan's best man, gruff and visibly emotional throughout the entire ceremony, despite his best efforts to hide it. Silas Cobb gave a toast so unexpectedly sentimental that half the Riverside hands claimed afterward they'd never let him live it down, though every one of them had tears in their own eyes by the time he finished. Sarah Kessler traveled 3 counties to attend, standing beside Margaret Holt and Otis Pruitt, and half the town that had once whispered ugly things and now stood united in genuine hard-won joy. Clara wore her mother's wedding lace, altered carefully by her own steady hands, and carried tucked discreetly into her bouquet the small wooden horse James had carved for their daughter, a quiet, private way of bringing them both along into this new chapter of her life without leaving them behind. Daniel Whitmore sent a letter that arrived just in time for the wedding. Congratulations scrawled in a hand, grown steady and strong, along with an invitation renewed. Come see us when you can, Ethan. My boy's asking after that horseman who taught his father everything he knows about riding true. Seems only fitting he learns from the same man someday. Ethan read that letter standing in the church vestibule minutes before the ceremony, and felt for the first time in his entire life that the weight he'd carried for a decade had transformed into something else entirely. Not gone, never fully gone, because some things a man carries forever in some quiet corner of his heart, but changed, lightened, made bearable by forgiveness, both given and received. Years later, Silver Creek would tell the story of Ethan Walker and Clara Bennett, the way small towns tell the stories that matter most to them. A little embellished with each retelling, the storm growing fiercer, the confrontation with Grayson growing more dramatic, the courtroom victory growing more decisive with every passing year until the details blurred pleasantly into local legend. But the heart of it never changed, never needed embellishing, because the truth of it was already remarkable enough on its own. A lonely cowboy carrying guilt heavy enough to keep him running for a decade found himself stranded by a storm outside a widow's shop. A grieving widow carrying loss heavy enough to keep her guarded for 3 long years found herself opening her door to a stranger instead of turning him away. And in the space between a broken saddle strap and a bowl of hot stew, in 4 simple words, asked with no expectation of anything in return, 2 broken people found the beginning of something neither one of them had believed they still deserved. The lantern in Clara's window. Their window, now in the little house they built together on the edge of the property, close enough to the shop that Clara could still hear customers' bells ring from the porch, close enough to Riverside that Ethan could still walk home each evening under a sky he'd once believed held nothing for him but more empty road. That lantern still burned every single night, without fail, for the rest of both their long, well-lived lives. Not because the darkness still felt too heavy to bear alone, but because some habits born first from grief become in time something entirely different. A promise, a welcome, a small and steady light that says to anyone who might need it that there is always room at this table for one more that questions asked. From genuine kindness, cost nothing and change everything, and that home in the end was never a place any lost soul had to find alone. It was a person. It was a lantern in a window. It was 4 words spoken plain and unguarded into a storm. Have you eaten? And for Ethan Walker, a man who had spent 10 long years believing he belonged nowhere at all, that single question became at last the answer to everything he had ever been searching for.